Hello ladies and gentlemen, welcome to a new episode with Mark Tech. The interesting thing about this is that I've obviously already streamed today, so I apologize for the kind of erratic schedule here. Big shout out to all the new subscribers on this channel, all the new followers on Twitter. It's been kind of amazing the way you guys have shown me support and love, so I'm really grateful for anyone who is joining. Seems like the stream is also working well. This is a big day, not the biggest day by any means, but it is the day where we are finally getting real iPhone 15 and 15 Pro reviews. What I will be primarily focusing on is covering iPhone 15 Pro and Pro Max reviews. As I've said before, I think the base iPhones are usually pretty easy to analyze. Maybe over the next couple of days and weeks, I'll catch up on some iPhone 15 content, specifically with how the main camera fares, given that it has noticeable technological differences to the Pros, both this year's Pros and last year's Pros. I have a big collection of videos that I can react to. I don't know if I'll be able to get to all of them. As I've said in the title, primarily we'll be reacting to Mrwhosetheboss, iJustine and The Verge, which I think all have something interesting to contribute. Some I agree with more than others. Obviously, I will not be reviewing like their main review ideas or like their conclusions, because obviously it's their review, right? They are free to observe whatever they observe. However, through the comparison to other reviewers and through just some common sense practices, I will criticize maybe the nature of the review, maybe the overall, not even like final conclusion, because obviously the final conclusion will be partially at least flavored by some of their individual findings. But yeah, basically the vibes, I guess, one would say. And specifically there are some reviews that are just a little cringe in that regard, where I'm not even criticizing their attempts to be funny or their attempts to provide some different perspective. I'll just say that sometimes like the balance of what they're focusing on is not right, in my opinion. It will not have a benefit for actual consumers. So yeah, this is a lot. I have like 5 videos ready to react to, potentially some websites to open. It will all depend on how many people join, how many people are interested, how many people will leave messages in the live chat. Please, if you are new here and you haven't yet subscribed, please consider subscribing, sharing, doing all that YouTube jazz, liking, of course. But yeah, without further ado, let's get into it. And let me just briefly check if my stream is fully functional. Yes, it is. That's really nice. So let's start. And as always, please let me know in the chat if the audio levels are right, if everything is basically well balanced, and yeah, how it all comes together basically.
Hertz ProMotion displays on the iPhone 13 Pros. The famous summary page that Apple makes for each of their new products. If you zoom out to the iPhone 15 Pro and 15 Pro Max, I think it's fair to say that these are a fairly forgettable set of...
I completely disagree. Quite honestly, I have found the 14 Pro a little more forgettable. I think the 12 obviously came with the redesign. I think the 13 Pros had ProMotion. I like Dynamic Island. I think Dynamic Island is cool. I like the 48 megapixel main camera, but I don't think there's anything in the 14 Pro that is more outstanding than anything that is in the 15 Pro. To me, an A17 Pro with ray tracing capabilities is more exciting. To me, like something like the 5x zoom camera is probably more interesting than the 48 megapixel camera in the 14 Pro. Don't forget, the 14 Pro was still relying on Smart HDR4, basically the same generation of processing as the 13 Pro did. So this idea that everything is just can be mushed together by, oh, one feature defines the generation, that has never been true in my opinion, and I think that's often why the S years are remembered rather fondly, because they usually come with a combination of processing speed improvements, camera improvements, and then something specific to the generation, right? How the iPhone 4S brought Siri, how the iPhone 5S brought fingerprint sensoring and stuff like that. Like then the 6S obviously had 3D touch, so there is a lot here that comes together, and I don't usually think that boiling it down to one feature that defines a generation, I don't think that ever works. Also, just a small distraction for me, as anybody who has followed me for a while, cheers. I'll try to mute myself whenever I'm drinking. I might forget it sometimes. So let's continue.
There is no one big defining feature that puts them on the map, like the dynamic island was on the iPhone 14 Pros, or the 120Hz ProMotion displays on the iPhone 13 Pros. The famous summary page that Apple makes for each of their new products, for this phone, half of it was filled with features that we're already well used to. There's not even a bold new color to aesthetically differentiate itself. This is the
this I also completely disagree with, because while I do like the colors on the 12 Pro and the 13 Pro, I do not think there's any standout color in the 14 Pro, except for like the fact that like gold was still present. I guess you could say that this is like the most standout color always whenever it's part of a lineup. Also beyond that, yeah, it's difficult to put in words, right? But I do love like the focus on the actual materials being used, and maybe it's the nerd part in me where I love that what Apple is advertising is like a visual thing about the phone, like the titanium is also part of like the structural integrity, better thermals, all that stuff. So yeah, to me, all of this stands out more than the dynamic island on the 14 Pro did. Not to say that the 14 Pro is bad by any means. I guess I might have been a little pissed off by the 14 Pro that the A16 was so similar to the A15, and I do like processor improvements, but I understand most people obviously don't think quite the same way I do.
Single driest selection in recent memory for me. But it's only now that I've started.
It's like my favorite color, like that blue. I know some people will say, oh, in some real world lighting it rather looks gray or sometimes blackish. I don't fucking care. I love that blue. I've seen it now in stills, I've seen it now in video. To me it works. Obviously I'll be getting it sometimes next week. Yeah, and then I'll be giving you my final impression. I've heard a lot of positive stuff about the natural titanium look, which I'm quite positively intrigued by. Maybe the year after I would consider it, but for now I do want me some blue again.
Living with it, that I've realized so many little things that are easy to miss, things that Apple didn't even mention, that all add up to make this a more surprising, more immediately beneficial experience than I would say I've had with any iPhone I've tested before this, especially when it comes to cameras. In case you're wondering, by the way, this is what you get when you order a 15 Pro. It's fairly standard Apple fare. No longer a black box like you used to get with Pros, I imagine to use less ink. Inside you get the phone, the new USB-C cable, and the little insert which has your SIM ejector tool, manuals, and a couple of Apple stickers.
By the way, this is not like very important, but when we are looking at the box, right, when Apple removes the SIM card tray, which I'm strongly in favor for, there is part of it that you can like use the extra space to make the phone either thinner, lighter, or add extra battery, more thermals, better antennas, whatever else you want, right? Then the other point is you don't have to ship a SIM ejector tool. So while yes, I do understand that some people will find it cringe whenever I say I am all for the thinnest possible boxes, I am all for as little clutter as possible, you also have to consider long term, like every single shaved off like 10, 20 pennies even allows Apple to keep prices the same. Like the fact that the iPhone 15 Pro starts at the same price as the iPhone 10 did in 2017, despite all the things that makes it objectively more expensive, like a new material, a ton of new technologies. And some of those tech specs don't scale in a way that lowers cost. Like sure, storage has gotten cheaper, good RAM has gotten cheaper, but for example, a decently large chip on 3 nanometer right now is not equivalent to a similarly sized chip on like 10 nanometer when the iPhone 10 was coming out. I think they were on 10 nanometer, right? The A11 chip. Yeah, right, because then the A12 was on 7 nanometer. I'm so sorry, that's the cold. But yeah, there's and then all the inflationary pressure and stuff like that. Companies will have to pay workers more, which I'm all in favor for. I'm a big union fan and all that stuff. I hope that more Apple stores unionize. Sometimes my biggest question is under which banner do they unionize, but ultimately that's for the workers to decide. So there are some unions that I absolutely will despise because they are led by completely bad people, but there's plenty, like just in general, I will support unionization over non-unionization.
Now, this cable is a bit of an upgrade.
It's braided, which is also nice. It's USB-C, which is, of course, nice given the phone that we have. Also, it's extra something that will add to Apple's costs because they do have an already giant like supply chain for basic plastic lightning cables. Now USB-C to lightning cables. Now it's Type-C to Type-C, which might make some things less complicated because they only have to produce like one connector, but in the end it is something that will eat into their MFI income, and of course a braided cable, even if it's just 2 cents more or something like that, is also more expensive. So yeah, we are definitely getting a lot more for our money here over the years. Not saying it's a lot more in comparison to something like the 14 Pro from just last year.
With this woven fiber around it, which is going to make it more durable and is very, very resistant to tangling. But just know that it isn't a fast cable. The iPhone 15 Pros are capable of USB 3 speeds, i.e. 20 times faster than Lightning used to be.
10 gigabits versus 480 mbits.
This is pretty standard for most phones though.
Yeah, glad that I actually pre-watched a lot of this. Not all that I have prepared, but I did watch the entire Mrwhosetheboss review. It's actually my favorite that I've seen thus far online. I would say I also want to like really review Super Saf once he does his usual high-end iPhone versus high-end Samsung comparison. But I do like that Mrwhosetheboss is generally well informed of what the competition is offering, not in terms of him like glamorizing any other feature from any other phone or downplaying anything from any other phone, but just understanding that, for example, something like the Galaxy Fold, which also has fast USB 3 speeds and supports something like Samsung DeX, still only comes with a USB 2 cable. So yeah, this is a pretty universal thing in the industry. Also, there will be other stuff mentioned throughout the videos, like power delivery actually being standard or not actually being very standard across Android devices. I do like me some callouts like this because I do believe that people have this idea that Apple is like draconian in the way what they ship or how they ship it, or and what exactly they like limit through software. There is some truth to that, and I've been always admitting to that. It's just some of it is like so cartoonishly depicted that I do like him just giving this basic info of like, you want the faster speed, similar to how basically every other phone, you'll have to pay for it.
Okay, so the first thing about these phones, which I guess I didn't realize the full potential of until switching to the Pro Max, is the Action button. This brand new programmable button that sits in place of the Ring silent switch that you can set to whatever trigger you want. And my hot take when I first saw this was, well, you can already program things to a triple tap of your power button.
I never use triple tap. I don't find it comfortable. To be honest, until he mentioned it, I forgot that I tried it out like a year ago or so. And I never liked tapping anything. I don't even know if it's fully customizable anymore. Maybe I should have looked into that. I use like the double tap and the triple tap on the back. But yeah, quite personally, I never did that with the home button. And the reason for that is Apple Pay. Apple Pay is a double tap. Usually I get it wrong sometimes, even though I don't get like the back tap wrong. I don't know why. Maybe I'm poorly coordinated and you can laugh at me, but it is what it is.
I bother doing the same thing to a button that's just much harder to reach. And the hard to reach part, that hasn't changed. It still makes no sense to me why a button designed around being a shortcut is so far out of the radius of where your fingers can reach in an
I guess
grip.
that's true, yes.
Use it or the camera. I would say that 80% of photos that I take on my phone, I do so in landscape mode. And that works really well with the action button, because when you go like this, your finger is naturally resting on it. The button's designed so that you have to hold for half a second or so to activate, I guess to reduce accidental presses, and then that activation can take you immediately to not just the camera, but exactly the camera mode that you want to be the default. And then if you do that, the action button will also double as your shutter button when you get there, which is interesting because I thought it might need to be still like the volume up button. So it's actually cool that you can press and click, right? So you wouldn't even have to move your finger, which could lead to you potentially dropping the phone if you maybe you have small hands and you need to move a lot, even though they are right next to each other. My only complaint about the action button, it really is where it's positioned. And that it's kind of small, but there is a good reason for it. This is really a mute switch replacement. This is not anything extra in the phone. Apple has not dedicated any extra space for like a power button-esque button like halfway across the phone. Where the SIM ejector tool, the SIM tray is on one side. On the other side, it clashes with a ton of other stuff like the processor, the battery, other antenna components. So yeah, Apple basically just took what was there, replaced it with something better, and that's why it is what it is. It's important context. There's a reason why Samsung gave up on like extra buttons, not even like trying to compete with Apple or OnePlus with something like a mute switch. It's because they had a strong internal layout that they really didn't want to compromise in other ways. Like, I think a lot of people forget just how much is like recycled, not even technology, but I would say knowledge, from one generation to the next. It's just good practice. That's what happens with everything. Origin, welcome for joining. You've already joined us this afternoon, so I'm really glad you can be here as well. Do you think you'll be always looking for it, like how you mistake power button and volume? I never mistake power button and volume. For one, I've been like conditioned with iPhones for years. Every small change that Apple enacts is something that I'm usually very informed over. Also, this is exactly where the mute switch used to be, so I don't actually think there is any room for mistaking it, unless you might be coming from another brand phone or something like that, or a very, very old iPhone generation where maybe the power button was like even slightly differently positioned than it is now, though volume up, volume down, and mute have always been there this way. Basically, it's really a no-brainer for Apple users, especially long-term Apple users. This is now the fastest way to be able to quickly record a clip when the opportunity unexpectedly arises. It's not perfect, because let's say if instead of here, the button was actually up here. That would mean
this is what I mean. This is the best position for an extra button. However, it is something that would require internal redesigns, and this is where I think haptic action buttons would come into play potentially, where Apple would have to position them close to like a haptic motor, and they obviously would have to have some kind of sensor in here, but I assume that would still be like a thinner internally than what you do. I know you guys don't see like my mouse, which I'm hovering over, but where his finger this is where basically like where I'm showing.
Properly grip the phone without worrying that you're actually covering the thing that's shooting the photos. Plus, you might find that for a lot of commands, it's actually much easier to map them to the power button or even the back tap feature, which every iPhone has. But the point is, action button, solid new feature, has its uses. And also, something Apple didn't really mention, but just kind of showed as part of one of their slides, was that the iPhone 15 Pros are coming with a new Thread radio, which may well make them better at communicating with other Apple smart home devices. So I have no doubt that people will find cool...
Nope, it's not just for Apple, it's for smart home accessories in general. It's something that Apple had already introduced, and something like the Apple TV. I have not gotten to test any of that functionality out because I don't have a lot of smart home accessories in that regard. My most important one is kind of my HomePod. But yeah, this is not Apple exclusive.
Ways to use this action button to even control the home. Okay, this is a phone. Let's talk about call quality.
It's so
we don't
gorgeous.
Talk about call quality very much, mostly because it doesn't tend to change between generations. But there is a really cool new improvement here to voice isolation. So I've got my fiance Drisha on the line right now. She's using a 15 Pro, and it sounds terrible.
Yeah, I've got the tap on, and it's super loud here.
Okay, so let's try the voice isolation.
Okay, so this is normal mode, and then this the voice isolation mode. And so now you're hearing it without any noise.
It literally feels like you've turned the tap off.
Yeah, that's magic. Obviously, this mode isn't new. You can use it on anything up from an iPhone XS. It uses the neural engine, and it gets better basically with every generation of sensor plus processor. And this is a specifically large jump. However, to anybody who plans on either owning anything or buying anything, XS and up, you have wide spectrum, which allows you to like let people listen into everything going on around you. Maybe you are at a waterfall and actually want people to listen to the waterfall. Or for example, my cat sometimes sits on my chest and she does that brrr sound, and then I turn on wide spectrum to let the people hear how she does it. You can also use it in something like voice memos and stuff, because once you have any kind of audio recording going on, whether it's a call or a voice memo, for example, in settings, this is when it shows up. I wish they were always there. I wish there was a way for me to basically prime my phone before I go into a call or a voice memo to adopt the right audio capture method. But it is what it is. It is Apple sometimes with their with trying to make everything automatic. They sometimes forget that manual can still be best.
We've played around with this a lot, and while the voice isolation won't improve the quality of your speech, it will pretty much erase all background noise without reducing it. And then just like the new FaceTime video effects, what's quite cool is that these voice effects, because they're happening on a hardware level, they persist whatever the software.
Yeah, hardware level is probably not fully the right term, but yes, it's basically system-wide, I guess would be the right way to label it, and it's really cool that it can happen without requiring like any API adoption from third-party developers. I think it's very well implemented the way Apple does these modes. Quite honestly, I would actually love all of those things to always be there in control center, so I can also manage whether I want like reaction shots in something like a Zoom meeting or something like that. So I do, because those modes are so good, right? It's not that I want them because they usually screw up. It's just I want the right mode with any given scenario.
Where you're using, whether it's a normal call, a FaceTime call, or a Zoom call. What I would love is to be able to get this working with voice notes too, because I mean clearly it can, and that is like my main form of communication nowadays.
Yeah, I actually, that's true. I mentioned it for voice memos. I know that it comes up later on. But that it comes into control center when you're like recording a voice memo. I don't know if it works with like super short-term audio. Or Origin, you're saying you can look at it later. What exactly did you mean?
Also surprised me when it comes to performance. Naturally, being the nerd that I am, one of the first things I did
2635 versus 2929. So this is like the 13-15% uplift that we have seen from multiple tests. The single core, interestingly, is going up by basically exactly 2 CPU performance cores. It does not seem to really go up from any performance improvements to the efficiency cores, which kind of makes me think that Apple primed the efficiency cores to really be maximally efficient. I don't know if there are any like architectural changes there. I assume it's pretty similar to last gen. I know some people have said like, oh, Apple's like instruction per clock does not improve that much, right? It's like it's a little higher clocked and it's a little more performant. However, Apple's instruction per clock is already the highest in the industry. So yeah, come at Apple once the arrest has caught up, because Apple is like 90 to 95% the single core performance of a 3900 KS. So yeah, at 3.7 gigahertz versus 5.5 gigahertz. If this was running at above 4 gigahertz, this would be, or at least above 4.1, it literally would be the fastest single core ever. And I kind of think that M3 will crack that record, unless Intel's like 14th gen is like technically another 10% faster, but also uses a ton of energy. Like obviously desktop comparison to a laptop, and especially a smartphone, is not very meaningful, but sometimes you do that for scientific stuff. Wait, I don't see any message origin with I want. I think this might be something that could have been deleted by the algorithm or something.
Run the Geekbench benchmark. The CPU in this new A17 Pro chip is coming out about 10% faster, and the graphics score is up by 20.
Really good. The sort of really strong results. It's also difficult because GFX bench results is something we've recently gotten, but the GFX bench shows like some tests being like 45% faster. So I do understand why Apple specifically mentioned 20%, because this is where they really, I think, compared compute performance. Obviously with stuff like mesh shading, and then on top of that ray tracing, the actual GPU is far more impressive than any 20% jump usually would indicate. No, Origin, you didn't send anything again. I think whatever you sent gets deleted by YouTube.
Last year, which is solid, and in a way a bit surreal, because it's actually approaching the graphics performance of the M2 powered MacBooks. But then at the same time, if we zoom out and look at what's happening in the general market, these are not out of the ordinary generational leaps in power. But what was genuinely surprising is that after a long time, it finally feels like we have something to do with that power. What you're seeing right now is Resident Evil Village.
This is always the case. I know people love to like say, oh, the iPad does not have Mac OS or something like that, or before that iPhone only had like mobile gaming. We had like stuff like 120 hertz games. We've had, and every year the camera uses the performance of the chip to really achieve great things. And even just a new chip, even if it's more powerful, will usually also have new stuff like the A16 with its and A15 with their like ProMotion handling display engine that also manage how far it ramps down or up in terms of refresh rate. And then, of course, even stuff like managing the new USB 3 port and stuff like that. There's always something you can use a new chip for. But like there's AV1 decoders in this one, which I assume would make potentially battery life during YouTube playback far better. So like don't lose yourself in the sauce. A17 Pro is a really nice improvement.
Playing on an iPhone, and we've seen plenty of
like sometimes I'm like Bernie Sanders in that regard. It's like my voice isn't quite the same, but for obvious reasons, despite my Jewish roots. But whenever Bernie is like, it's the millionaires and the billionaires, I mentioned that I sometimes do like the exact same hand motion. just because I want something to happen in the camera part, even though it's like what 3% of the actual like screen area that you'll see.
Pretty phone games before, like Genshin Impact. But what is crazy about
Also getting improved, by the way.
this is that this is not Resident Evil Village mobile. This is Resident Evil, the same Resident Evil that you've seen on console.
And it's not just Resident Evil Village, which is 7, it's also RE4 Remake, it's also Death Stranding, it's also Assassin's Creed Mirage, it's also updates to Genshin Impact on Honkai Star Rail, which are some of the biggest games on mobile. So there's a lot here, and it's just the first wave.
All the assets and the textures are taken
Aw,
straight from the PlayStation
she
4
reminds me
version
of
the game,
Bella,
and then
she's so
pairing that
cute.
with some of the text
Bella,
from the
do you
PS5
want to
version
show
of the game,
yourself?
Like HDR, which is a much higher
No, she
brightness
doesn't.
than last-gen consoles could support. Now, as someone who has played this game on current-gen consoles, holding it in my hand, not even on one of those bulky handheld PCs with a battery life of 2 hours on a smartphone, is very impressive. It is only running at 720p resolution.
Yes, it will obviously do some things to both preserve battery life and to probably sometimes hit higher than 30 FPS, I assume. The main thing here is, to me personally, is the potential for you as a consumer to buy something and then access it on more and more devices without having your experience compromised. If you buy a high performance game, something potentially with ray tracing support on iPhone, and then you move up to an iPad with like an M1, M2, M3 chip. Now, I don't yet know how this specific wave of games will, where exactly they will be supported. I've tried to look it up on Apple's website, wasn't there. But then there's the Mac, and especially if you get like an M3 generation Mac, it will not only scale with the compute, but it will also support technologies like ray tracing and AI-based upscaling. And going back to that 720p thing, there are some games on PS5 that technically run at 720p, but then use FSR for upscaling to a higher resolution. The iPhone will be able to use AI-based Metal FX on a very highly optimized SoC. So this is very different from using like a generalized open technology that is algorithm based. This is AI stuff. This is the good shit from DLSS, and not DLSS first gen, which was technically not even really AI based, but it's obviously a different conversation for a different time.
As opposed to the 900p that the PlayStation 4 runs the game at. But still, the fact that it is the same game that runs on a box like this, or a box like this, on your phone, that fits in your pocket, and also includes the display, the surround sound speakers, and everything else built in.
Yeah.
It has definitely felt like one of those feat of technology moments. Excuse the bedazzling. So many times when I'm away somewhere, the only gadget I have with me is my phone. And I just wished that I could have some proper, meaty, offline, single-player games that I could sink my teeth into. So if this
Proper
whole console
AAA
gaming on
single-player
phone thing
games
actually catches
are
on now,
the best.
I'm going to be a very happy guy, and you probably won't see many tech videos. But we don't know if it will yet. There's only 4 console games like this currently announced exclusively for the Pro iPhone 15s. One of them is the latest Assassin's Creed, which is very cool and surreal because that game looks like this. But one of the games that I spent growing up with on my PlayStation Portable was also Assassin's Creed, and that looked like this.
Never
But
owned
it
a
does
PSP or
raise
Vita.
questions. Like, how easy is it to port over a PlayStation 4 game to an iPhone? How many will come after this initial honeymoon period? And will they also come to Android phones later on? Because powerful as this is, the graphics performance on the iPhone is not dissimilar to what you get on the latest Samsung. We have no idea.
I actually have a counterpoint to this questioning, which is I'm not a developer, and I do understand that Android is not as shitty to develop for as it was 10 years ago. However, for one, there is still fragmentation between like display sizes, pixel densities, but that's not that difficult to tune for. You have that same shit basically on PC with external monitors. Even aspect ratios are something easy to correct for relatively. The main problem would be with Android would be deciding between OpenGL, which really is not an option for AAA games anymore, and Vulkan, which is not that optimized for. I do assume though that after this, probably Google will like go to the Chronos group, like the open standards group managing like graphics APIs like OpenGL and Vulkan, and they might like hash out something with them that like Android 15 will have like a super next gen Vulkan support or something, because like the Snapdragons already do support ray tracing. Technically, we don't know how much faster it is than software based ray tracing, and Apple definitely will have advantages such as there are super big amounts of cache, while Androids could use something like LPDDR5X or 5T for a super high-speed bandwidth in comparison to the iPhone. So while I don't think necessarily that, I don't think the S24, the S23 is comparable anymore. But I definitely do believe that it will consume more power, but it will have better thermals and technically a slightly larger battery. So I do think that the S24 Ultra will be comparable to the iPhone 15 Pro. Yes, I do believe that. Origin, instead of making a gaming PC smaller like most brands, Apple made the already pocket-sized computer a gaming machine. Apple have kickstarted a new trend. Yeah, and it's not like Qualcomm will need to join with just like raw compute. Qualcomm with Google and like the Chronos group for Vulkan will need to come together and really make sure that there is zero scenarios where OpenGL somehow runs faster. If you look at like the benchmark for Geekbench compute and you compare like like OpenGL and Vulkan, like it's a mess. And then of course, like depending on the specific game and stuff that you're running, yeah, so iPhone usually, the only reason why iPhone doesn't usually always win is thermals, which Apple has been a little cheap on. This absolutely is an industry breakthrough, yes.
There is also support for Wi-Fi 6E baked into that package, which is basically a less congested version of Wi-Fi 6, but does need a router specifically with that technology in mind. Okay, let's talk about the design. Right now, where we are with the iPhone 15 Pros is a high point. We've just come from a set of phones that were pretty, yes.
It's a refinement, a very strong refinement.
A set of phones that are just as pretty but more comfortable thanks to the new contoured edges, much lighter thanks to the material swap to titanium, not to mention more practical thanks to having a matte finish all the way around. With the iPhone 14 Pro that I used to use, the fingerprinty stainless steel sides, the couple of marks I've gotten in my charging port from where I've, well, missed, and the dust in the mute slider are the only giveaways that this is a well-used phone. But with these, I mean, obviously we'll need about 3 months to say anything conclusively, but it feels like the combination of having both matte and brushed side rails should help to highlight.
Yeah, I'll admit, for like a lot of photos, like natural titanium does look the best. I am still, for like most real-world scenarios, I will favor the blue because I do like blue. But when it comes to just how much cleaner, obviously non-colored, non-painted metal is, yeah, there definitely are some advantages here.
It's not the dream though, because even though the material does hide scratches better, it does look like it can be scratched easier. And also, fingerprints on these darker phones tend to show up as a light area, which means that around your buttons you tend to almost get this haloing effect from past fingerprints that you struggle to wipe away. They're not permanent marks, they'll come off straight away if you go in there with a cloth, but you can't be doing that every day, so you will notice it from time to time. Zooming out a little, I still think the most comfortable shape that a phone can be is pebble-like. I've asked my whole family, and every person...
Like the iPhone XS, whenever I touch my mom's iPhone, which used to be mine, and I take it out of the leather case and I feel just how smooth those edges are. Now, it's not the most efficient way to package something because technically you lose some area here. It's similar to the complaint that I have with round smartwatches, but far less pronounced. It's that usually all your components are somewhat rectangular and somewhat sharp edged almost. So those curvy edges kind of clash with most of the components that you are likely to use here. This does, to me, this even looks better with the way like the light bends around it. I also think it doesn't make the bezels look big if you have relatively large bezels. But yeah, it's a matter of preference. I personally would take this again as a shape, but Apple had a lot invested into like those rectangular bodies. Basically, it is very recognizable currently as an iPhone. Though, by the way, look, this is an iPhone 11 Pro. And it had like that tri-camera setup. Look where we are now, right? This is a phone from 2019. This is a phone from 2023. Anybody who tries to tell you, and I've said it in my last couple of videos, anybody who tells you that Apple changes certain design aesthetics just for the sake of basically marketing is lying to you. Look at how logical this is for like a 4-year gap. This is absolutely meaningful, and it's not by any means just like, oh, we wanted to change the camera to like a long line again, or to like a perfect square by adding like a worthless 2 megapixel macro mode camera or something like that. No, all of the decisions here make sense.
Agreed that the iPhone 11 Pro is more comfy to hold and use than the 15 Pro, but then I suppose that thing has its own set of issues because the curved nature of the phone introduces a bulge around the screen. And that's actually something the new phones do especially well. The bezels are really, really slim. And it's one of those things that, of course, you will get used to, the same way you get used to the acceleration of a new car or the sound quality of a great audio system, but then anytime you get a hint of perspective, like seeing anyone else's older iPhone, it does make you reappreciate what I think is a bit of a design feat. Okay, so I mentioned that cameras are something pretty special on these phones. And let's be very clear about something. What makes these cameras special is no one thing in isolation. It's not about the ultra-wide camera that lets in a bit more light. It's not about the new coating that helps reduce the amount of lens flares on this lens, because honestly, you still get enough.
And basically, there is no individual thing here that even could stand out, given that the hardware, except for the 5x telephoto, is pretty much identical. Apple, for one, the A17 Pro obviously will deliver new functionality. Apple did have like 2 years now to move on from their smart HDR4 algorithm to something new, and obviously this is Apple's second year of using this specific 48 megapixel sensor. It's still their second gen, but the second year of it, of sensor shift image stabilization. Basically, with the 13 Pro being the first gen, the 14 Pro being the second gen, and now it being reused on the 15 Pro. And there is value sometimes in reusing hardware. Google is probably the best example, where their continued use of the same like Sony 12 megapixel sensor that became basically microscopic in comparison to other contemporary sensors was so good, and their algorithm came to improving specifically on that one generation of sensors, that I would argue this is the best utilized sensor in like probably in history. In fact, when Google moved away from it, sure, their generalized algorithms were still really good, and they definitely updated them and optimized them for the latest sensor, but I would say the jump was not that large, given how much larger the sensor was, the better optics and stuff like that. The software was just so good for that old sensor that even similarly good software was not able to bring out as much from something new.
Lens flares on the main camera to account for both. It's not any of these pieces on their own, but it's how the whole thing works together as a system that's even better than the sum of its parts. And this is the thing that I've only now realized having used the phones. So, for starters, the iPhone 15 Pros take 24 megapixel photos.
They do.
Again, that doesn't sound very impressive when you think that the latest Samsung can take a 200 megapixel shot. But it's the fact that the iPhone can do this 24 megapixel by default. That's the key thing. That it takes 24 megapixel in auto mode with no perceptible compromise that I can see. Not in terms of the time taken to capture, not in terms of the dynamic range of the image, not in terms of the amount of post-processing that happens afterwards. It's actually faster here to take a 24 megapixel shot than it is for most phones to take a 12 megapixel shot, which is the industry standard default even for phones which have 200 megapixel camera sensors. So that's one part of it. But then you've got the file format. Most phones, when they take photos, they output those photos as JPEG images. photos. For quite a few years though, the iPhone instead uses a file format called HEIF, which is really similar to JPEG in image quality, but with smaller file sizes, actually about half the size. Now that the resolution of the photos has gone up though, the image size has gone up with it. But even though the resolution has doubled, the image size has only gone up 1.5 times, which leaves you with this bizarre situation where the 24 megapixel shots taken here take up less space than the 12 megapixel shots on other phones.
By the way, this is where value comes from in terms of Apple's ecosystem. It's not as easy as making sure, like, we live in a highly capitalist society. Obviously, we are not going to get something that one-to-one reflects the value of the work put into it, or the raw materials put into it, the transportation costs put into it. At that point, we would probably, even if we were to account for a small profit margin, we probably would be paying around $600 instead of $1,000, and we would probably be paying around $650 instead of $1,200. However, the point here is that they are competing with other brands that, for example, do start at $1,200 or $1,300, like the Galaxy Ultra phones. And then you have to consider what that means, right? Sure, the iPhone Pro did not get more storage, and the iPhone Pro Max now has more storage, but at a higher base price, basically price matching the previous generation 256 gig config. But you have all those other things that give it extra value. Its long software support is not just something that, oh, it technically is newer, right? Because like an old phone doesn't stop working, but it keeps it more secure, it keeps it more optimized. And there are a ton of interesting stuff, like iOS 17, for example, has like zero shutter lag for a lot of iPhones, because what it does is optimizes it to capture something before you actually click the button. It does not make your photos look better on a phone with older HDR technology, but it even though it technically could, if Apple is like able to leverage the processor a little better, it doesn't really matter though. But there's, and then you have like the smaller file sizes, which, by the way, HEIF and H.265 recording were added later as software updates. So it's not even something that Apple launched day one on every phone. So sometimes when people try to compare, I've always been critical on something like the non-Pro sticking with 60 hertz, while a lot of the industry is at 90 hertz, at 120 hertz, even in that price range. But I always try to encourage for people to look beyond just the raw, like, value of the metals, basically, even though titanium is not cheap.
And that smaller file now also includes both the portrait mode data and the live photo data at the same time. This is kind of where it really started to click with me, because I think, like, motion photos in general are an amazing feature. I was making a little video.
I don't like them, but again, to each their own.
Trisha and I's anniversary recently, and the only way that video was possible was because for every photo I'd taken of us, the phone was also storing the entire scene just before that shot was captured. And so long as you're doing that, it is super quick to then save that motion as its own video, which you can put into a longer project. But then I also love portrait mode. Every single time I'm trying to take a nice photo for someone else, I will take like 3 normal shots, and then I'll take a separate set of 3 portrait shots.
Okay, if to me it's like more like 3 in 1 or 2.
The normal shot is very practical and utilitarian, and then the portrait shot is very cinematic. All of that extra time, all of that faff, and all of that having to think is just gone now. Because you don't need to be in portrait mode to take portraits. You just take the photo as you always do, and as soon as a person, a dog, or a cat appears in the image, this little F will pop up. When that F pops up, you know that you are automatically capturing depth information, and that you can go back into the shot after you've taken it to tweak the level of portrait mode you want to apply. Again, in 24 megapixels, so double the resolution that portrait mode used to be. The F will also come up if you ever tap to focus, because then the phone knows that you're
that's really good to know. Maybe I've ignored that when I first watched the review. That's actually really like good for usage, because then it means that you basically have a surefire way to guarantee depth map recording, which is really good for tuning afterwards. So the fact that you basically, whenever I assume it would need like probably like a good focus. Maybe it wouldn't work as well in low light or something like that. It kind of makes me think if like LiDAR is helping a lot with this, though they do have 3 sensors. So technically there's a lot of position data that can be shared. Also, you have a thing like sensor shift image stabilization, which could help you like understand just how much your phone is moving and stuff like that. Plus you have autofocus pixels, which also technically slightly understand their position. So yeah, there's a lot of data that Apple can be using, but that also means a lot of data that needs to be processed, and this is why something like the A17 Pro will be basically like crucial here to still make photo capture super fast, the camera app super responsive. It's really a delicate balance.
Focus on something in particular, which means that even if you miss focus on that subject in the moment, you can go back in afterwards and tweak it.
Oh, so
what
good.
I'm really getting to here is that Apple has managed to build with the iPhone 15 Pros a camera system for which all you have to think about is just this one thing. Is it framed the way that I want it to be? The rest is done for you, as well as now Photonic Engine. This was introduced last year as a level of processing applied to each image to add in extra detail and fix up the colors. But when it was announced, it wasn't for all camera modes. For things like portraits and night mode, which already required a lot of processing, there wasn't enough headroom to also have the Photonic Engine going on. Not anymore. It now works in portrait mode, it works in night mode, it works on the front camera, and it works on every single magnification of the rear camera. And you can really tell the difference. Like, I went out a couple of days ago to get some shots of the night sky, and while sometimes between iPhone generations you do struggle to notice the difference, the improvements here are at a glance instantly recognizable. And the other thing that they've addressed is HDR. HDR in photos is one of Apple's historic long-running weaknesses. I think it originates from the fact that Apple doesn't want to over-process images, but the truth is, in a lot of cases, like when you have really harsh backlighting behind you, you kind of have to. Well, it's better here. I wouldn't say that Apple's completely solved all instances of parts of the image being overexposed, but at the same time, I didn't expect a difference this noticeable versus last year's phone.
I almost don't think that Apple will ever try to fully fix it in a way that I think would ever make the phone like look unnatural. Though obviously this is a huge jump forward. If there are like ever so small areas that Apple would have to leave like slightly like basically like white, right, this is up to them. If they make like 90% of the image look as good as this does, this to me is more than enough, because to me the problem has always been the vibe of HDR pictures, or like all pictures are HDR, but you know what I mean. So to me, like whenever you lost detail because of bad HDR handling, that was always the problem. Like I can always go back and make something look a little brighter or a little darker. The problem is that it would end up looking really bad. Sometimes shadows are so dark that you brightening them up afterwards has no meaningful change, and sometimes outblown like super bright spots don't make any sense to darken them because they didn't capture the detail underneath that light. So this looks leagues ahead.
Tell on the rear camera, and you can also tell on the front camera. So do you kind of see what I'm saying about these cameras? This idea that no individual aspect is particularly groundbreaking or new, it's just the fact that it all comes together in the highest quality, lowest hassle way that I've ever seen, with, by the way, the smoothest operating version of the camera app that I've ever seen on a phone.
That's also positive to hear, though.
File. Now, it's not perfect. I didn't love how Apple's trying to pitch this thing as 7 lenses in your pocket. There's some truth to it, but you can't really take that statement at face value. See, the way it works is the iPhone 15 Pros have a 48 megapixel main camera sensor. If you tap on this one-time zoom, it'll cycle between 3 different focal lengths, between 1x and 1.5x. Now, because the camera is 48 megapixel and you're outputting images in 24 megapixel, you can, between 1x and 1.5x zoom, use different amounts of this full sensor to achieve a result that is still genuinely a 24 megapixel shot. And so on the bright side, when you take, let's say, a 35mm photo, it is more detailed than if you just took a 1x shot and zoomed in till it looked like a 30.
Yeah, this is, by the way, it's very good that he mentions this, because I understand the criticism against saying, oh, it's 7 lenses. However, there is a super res zoom on Google phones, right? And it technically allows you to capture like 10x on the 5x zoom lens as if it was native. What it does, it captures some of the data from like the main sensor with a lot better low light sensitivity there, of course. It then uses some tricks from stabilization to make sure it really knows how individual pixels are separated, so the detail is still there. And obviously there are a ton of like algorithms, maybe some AI stuff as well. This to me is what validates Apple's claims. And don't just take my word or Mrwhosetheboss word for it. Like, I've downloaded the iPhone 15 Pro review from Petapixel. This is the guy, those are the guys who used to do like the this famous camera review site, DP Review, right? But that was shut down. It was like acquired by Amazon, then shut down, and now they basically have Petapixel as their channel, and they really also cover this, really showing that yes, this is better than just a native thing. Basically, it's better the way that Apple, and the reason why I mentioned super res zoom is because having those separate like lens pre-setups allows Apple to basically check each individual resolution's algorithms to perfectly transfer it to 24 megapixels and to still do all the like the frame stacking technology, stuff like that. There's a reason, for example, why some phones will do like portrait mode with an ever so slight zoom. There is value sometimes in small zoom, like there's sometimes fringing on the edges, and technically your motion data is more precise in the middle and stuff like that, given how light comes like this into your sensor. So there's a lot here to consider, and the fact that it is more detailed is what justifies the claim to me. Is it as relevant as if the camera had optical zoom capabilities where it was able to go from 1x to 1.5x? No, it's not. However, it is still a nice thing, and this almost makes me think that Apple would not implement variable zoom on the zoom camera on the telephoto eventually, but just going with those kinds of tricks, because if they use like a 48 megapixel in the next like 5x zoom camera, they could then still offer you like a 10x zoom with a perfect 12 megapixel camera, with a 12 megapixel zoom into the sensor.
5mm photo. But then the downside is that when you do this, you're not using the full extent of your sensor, and therefore the image quality isn't as high. I wouldn't say that degradation is noticeable.
That's not true. You're just using a smaller part of the sensor. Technically, if you were to zoom in, like that's literally not what you just said. This is a clear wrong conclusion. It's a smaller image, absolutely, which yes takes away from some of the appeal of a large 48 megapixel sensor because you're not using every pixel. Which I guess the comparison here would be against not digitally zooming in with, but would be against moving in to the object to achieve a similar like lens equivalent, even though that's not true physically whatsoever, but I'll just use that. Or at least a similar zoom range, right? One would be like technically zooming in, the other would be a little closer. And yes, in that case, the one that is closer would be giving you the better quality. However, the point for this is that you might not want to move around. Sometimes you would want to work in a specialized environment that is space limited and stuff like that. You might be standing on the edge of the cliff and really want to have like a specific like lens equivalent for whatever reason. And it's good that Apple does that. Technically what he's saying is true, but he didn't word it the right way, because the way he worded it, it kind of contradicts his own conclusion that he just gave 10 seconds prior. But I do understand what he means.
But it will be there, and it's just a bit icky to call this a 7-lens system.
It's not.
But really, if you're going to do that, you could just add a stop at every single possible different magnification and then call it a 1,000-lens camera system.
No, that's actually not true. This is the point here, which is that all those stops would just be digital zoom, while Apple specifically optimized 1.2x and 1.5x for the algorithm to combine into their new 24 megapixel photos. So no, it's not the same.
As a feature, it's fine. It does the job, but unlike the way it's being presented, it is not the same as actually having 7 lenses. Right.
No,
now let's
they're
talk
not
about the
the
new zoom
same.
camera. So for the iPhone 15 Pro Max only, the 3x optical zoom lens camera has become a 5x optical zoom lens camera. And this is a bigger upgrade than it initially seems. They've not just taken the zoom camera that was already on the Pro and stuck a bigger lens on it. The Pro Max has a larger sensor and better stabilization than the regular Pro 2.
I do understand that better stabilization. I did not know that it would have a larger sensor. Maybe I'm misremembering.
And let's be very clear, even though 5x zoom is not the highest magnification we've ever seen on a phone by a long shot, this is still a very good quality 5x zoom camera. Which means that in most lighting conditions, the shots look pretty good even at 10x. And the lens has so much natural foreground-background separation that oftentimes you don't even need to rely on portrait mode for that DSLR-like separation. And check this is a 1x zoom portrait taken on the 15 Pro Max. Notice how much distortion there is on my face. Taking a portrait at 3x is far more flat.
Yeah, I checked it. Apparently it is a slightly larger sensor. That actually, well, that makes it kind of a no-brainer to me then. Yeah, really, the Pro Max is the better deal.
Because you get to be further away, and then 5x ever so slightly even more flattering than a 3x. So it has a purpose, and it's just a fun tool to have. Because
also, by the way, this is exactly why I really favor 4x. Look at both images right now, and you'll find that like 5x might be like you could come closer into this, right? And with a 4x achieve the same result. Then with 3x here, where is it? Nope. Yeah, here. That's 1x, does not look good. 3x, yeah, I kind of would prefer some kind of middle ground between those. It also would make it far more easier to like have something quality between 3 and 5x, because between, let's say, even 2x and 5x, because right now at 3x you don't actually have any kind of optical image capture at on the 15 Pro Max. So that's a shame. This is where I want a variable zoom lens camera, and I actually want a variable zoom on every single sensor. I kind of would prefer like a two camera setup where both cameras have like basically the same sensor, the same lenses almost. I know there will be some trade-offs based on the actual zoom range that you want to achieve, and then I would like something that is between 0.5x or like 12 millimeters. Did I say millimeters or milliliters? It's millimeters. To, let's say, 36, right? Which would technically be like 1.5x for the main. It would be 3x over the ultra wide, and then beyond that maybe you start at 72 millimeters and then up to, let's say, 120 millimeters you have variable zoom as well. This would be my dream camera setup. I know there probably isn't technology, especially for the main / ultra wide, to achieve that without significantly like making the sensor smaller, unless we're talking about a much thicker phone and stuff like that. But it's definitely possible for the zoom camera, and it's pretty much what the Xperia phones already do, and it's a technology that LG has also shown off. So this is definitely, while I don't see it coming in the 16 Pro, because I think the 16 Pro will be the generation where just the Pro and the Pro Max get the same cameras once again. But then I think that with the 17 Pro, maybe with the 17 Pro Max only, or by that point maybe just the 17 Ultra it will be called, this is where I assume we would get that kind of technology if Apple ever plans on introducing it.
slightly even more flattering than a 3x. So it has a purpose, and it's just a fun tool to have, because 5x feels like such a distinct image to what a 1x image looks like. And you don't have to step back as much as I was expecting to fit the person that you're trying to shoot in the frame. But it is still very much a trade. See, the way the main camera sensor on this phone works, you can only get so-called lossless zoom in between 1x and 2x. And so the entire gap between your 2x and your 5x zoom range now, that relies on pure digital zoom, which is why in these shots, the 3x image, while flattering, is definitely the weakest quality. And as you get to like 4.9x, like just before the 5x optical zoom camera kicks in, it does start to look a bit rough. Also, worth bearing in mind, the optical zoom cameras on both the Pro and the Pro Max, they're not 24 megapixel, they're still 12, as is the...
I have criticized that repeatedly, and I've said that in this video as well. However, the reason why I'm still in favor for 5x, I wouldn't be in favor of 6x whatsoever. I think 5x is already a little too much, but I guess I can still compromise for that with coming in a little, going a little further back or something. But the 3x on my 13 Pro Max just does not turn on that much. Like, I understand it's gotten better on the 14 Pro, and now there's the photonic engine and stuff like that that helps it in low light, but the sensor is so much smaller than the main one, the aperture is so much worse, that to me, yeah, like, I would rather have a really high quality 5x zoom than I would have like a 3x zoom that is barely better than a crop of the main sensor, to the point where the 3x is usually replaced by a crop of the main sensor because it has so much better low light capability. Because of just how much further away it is, 5x will not be as easily replaceable by a crop to the main sensor. And plus it is a slightly larger sensor now, as I read, which is interesting. But yeah, it is definitely a trait, as he says, but I think it's overall a net positive.
Ultra-wide lens, which is pretty normal for a phone, but it just feels like one of the only slight remaining inconsistencies. But camera comparison versus the Samsung coming very shortly, so if you want to see that, then a sub to the channel would be mega pixel.
That's a funny joke.
Now, based on some browsing on X, people are worried about battery, and rightly so. The iPhone 13 Pro and 13 Pro Max had insane battery for their respective sizes.
Nope, not rightfully so. This is where I will go completely against him and anybody who tries to buy into narratives from online. My iPhone 13 Pro Max degraded by almost 10% in terms of battery after 1 year. Then it went down in no time to 86%, and now it has stayed at that exact 86% by like 7 months. So battery readings are not super precise. Battery readings will change from gen to gen. So anybody who says that the 14 Pro has degraded faster than the 13 Pro because it changed by 2 percentage points more in the settings app, that is 100% unscientific. The battery readings change from gen to gen as sensors evolve, as new batteries are used, as the processor changes. And of course, there's also still the point that the 14 Pro is a more used device by people without even understanding it. It has an up to 2 times brighter screen outdoors, which also will create more heat. And while some people will say, but it has like better cooling, sure, but a lot of the heat will still impact the actual battery. And what else will greatly diminish potentially the longevity of the actual battery is something like always on display. The reason why usually like old acid batteries are in some ways better than lithium ion is because they have extremely low standby mode draw. Basically they basically shut off, you could say. Lithium ion always has some movement through the electrolyte. It's just natural for it. It's very, very little. It's 1/1,000,000th of what it is usually, or something like that, right? But it is still happening. And on a smartphone with actual standby, it does not reach those hypothetical, like super low, like standby currents. It is far above that. And it is basically worse at maintaining it than something like those acid-based batteries. So what happens if you have higher power draw in standby is it impacts the battery life cycle disproportionately more so than you would usually expect from standby, because always on display, sure, while it's not very high energy consumption, it keeps the actual display active and a little bit more of the processor. It has a specialized display engine for it after all, which is efficient, but it's by no means zero. And then you have your other background processes, which obviously will depend on the time of day, how many messages you get, how many background tasks you have turned on in settings and stuff like that. But there are good reasons for why 14 Pros could go down, and none of them have to do with it being basically a shitty phone that people should be worried about. If you are actually unhappy with the battery life of your phone because it does more or way better than the previous generation, you should consider tuning some things down. You should consider turning off always on display, and you should consider not letting it run to full brightness outside, especially in the heat, which is where you're most likely to use it, because highest brightness is usually needed in the summer. Again, not trade-offs that most people will make, and the fun part is that enthusiasts who are complaining about it on Twitter should be the first ones to know it, but they also do like complaining.
But then the 14s were not as good, and they also seem to degrade faster over time. Now,
Wrong.
that could be a
As
few
I've said
different things.
before.
It could be the iOS 17 beta. That was pretty rough on battery. It could be the extra brightness of the screen.
How many, like, how relevant is testing from beta users though? Like, I am a beta user. If somebody were to come to me and I was like complaining about overheating on iPhones because of me running beta, or because the beta like potentially even did some damage, can happen. It doesn't usually happen, but can, right? It's not relevant. It's a beta. At best, it informs Apple to be a little more careful with what betas they roll out. But betas are not designed for the average mainstream. Maybe it is actually the beta, because this year it's the first time where you can use a developer beta without paying for a developer account, which is so fascinating. So maybe that's what encouraged like some battery degradation from enthusiasts, but I just wouldn't take it too serious.
More pressure on the battery and causing more heat on the inside, which can permanently degrade your cell. Whatever it was, Apple didn't really acknowledge or address any battery concerns, so it's not clear if any of those long-term effects will be present. But what I can say is that the iPhone 15 Pros are better for sure than the 14 Pros, with a bigger battery capacity, more mature software.
Battery capacity is up by 1 to 2%, so that will not heavily impact it, but okay.
And better heat dissipation.
It's also primarily way more efficient processor, but okay. Yeah, like Mrwhosetheboss is knowledgeable, and I did like really praise him for like understanding like what is happening with other phones, but like I don't think he always grasped like the really fine technological differences, which is also natural, by the way. This will probably happen to me as I get distracted by my main job, as I try to cover more tech in general if I really keep this channel going. So this is not like a big complaint even, it's just something worth mentioning, I guess.
Which should make that battery last longer over time. But as well as a camera test, there will also be a very detailed battery test alongside it, so there will be a lot to talk about there. I am slightly sad to see that the charging speed hasn't gone up, which would have been one of the main perks of a USB 3 port.
That will be coming next year when Apple will use stacked batteries, which will increase density a little bit and will also help with heat dissipation, because stacked, like basically like zigzag internal battery arrangements are better than rolled things. It's it is what it is. It is unfortunate. I think if this technology had come to this iPhone, I do believe this would probably be more meaningful than like the 13 Pro Max was, with its gigantic battery, with the A15 being meaningfully faster than the A14, especially in like graphics tasks, it having ProMotion, having a 3x dedicated zoom versus 2.5x. Which is actually a similar like difference in terms of like ratio, right? It's not exactly the same, obviously. It's gone up by 1/5 versus here it's gone up by like 2/3, but in terms of zoom range. But it's actually interesting how many similarities you can find between the upgrade to the 13 Pro and the 15 Pro.
But at least the phone does leverage some of the capability of USB-C with the ability to reverse charge your AirPods.
Which is so cute that people are covering it. This is almost one feature that I don't think is worth covering, because this will lead to people like degrading their battery, and then in a year will come back and complain about it once again. Also, this is a feature that is available on other Android phones, so covering it in a way as if Apple, this is actually one of those things where it makes Apple look more innovative than they actually are, because reverse wireless charging, given that they have MagSafe, now I fully understand the problems with reverse wireless charging for certain MagSafe stuff, especially from iPhone to iPhone, and even iPhone to AirPods. You have to understand that like the MagSafe has the batteries obviously have a polarity, and the polarity is tuned for MagSafe accessories, not for other actual MagSafe devices. So this is, for example, why the battery pack supports reverse wireless charging, but why AirPods Pro do not.
Is great news, and what I'm really surprised Apple didn't talk about at the event was that it's not just AirPods. The fact that your iPhone 15s can now deliver power through USB-C means that almost anything that you can plug this cable into, you can charge. Which means that for the first time since switching to the iPhone like 4 years ago, I don't have to feel like I'm the battery leech in my friend group. I guess the main perk of
this is curious to me. Just like, how often would you even do this? None of my Android owning friends have ever shared battery life with each other, and certainly not with me. And I do have USB-C to Lightning cables.
iPhone being USB-C now is some semblance of stability. This move was always on the horizon. It always felt like it could be just next year when Apple switched over. And so now that it has just happened, you can safely invest in some USB-C accessories that you know won't become outdated for at least a couple of years, but probably more. I know there's been a lot of rumors about a portless iPhone, but honestly, I just think they're a long way off. There are so many things that would suffer if Apple made that move anytime soon, like being able to listen to proper lossless music, being able to transfer massive ProRes video files, which Apple is touting as one of the new features that you should use, as well as all kinds of really niche things like using your phone as a screen to pilot a drone, where you need the lowest latency possible. In order to bring this all together then, we need to consider the prices. For the iPhone 15s, the Pro is staying at its price of $999, and the Pro Max is going up by $100 to $1,199. To which I would say, I think the normal Pro is in a really good place right now. It's an iterative phone, but
I actually think the Pro Max makes so much more sense now that the weight has actually gone down. I do understand that 220 grams is probably still a little too heavy for many people in comparison. Even something like the 14 Pro was around 205, 206-ish grams. But yeah, I do believe that the Pro Max makes a ton of sense now.
One that ties together a lot of the loose ends that Apple has had over the years, integrating all the bitty camera features together, sanding down the rougher edges of the design, and bringing a little lift to the battery while it's at it. The Pro Max is a bit of a harder pill to swallow, since the only additional difference for the extra $100 gap in price is more storage and your 3x lens becoming a 5x lens, which is an upgrade, but not a massive one, and one that in some situations can leave you with worse shots than the 3x. But that does not invalidate it. The 15 Pro Max is still the phone for people who want the best iPhone. It's the phone that I've already switched to, especially because of the battery. And also, important note, the phone isn't actually necessarily more expensive. The quoted prices that Apple gives are always US, but like here in the UK, the 15 Pro Max is the same price as the 14 Pro Max, and that's the 14 Pro Max with half the storage.
Yes, same here in Euro. I believe it's like €14.49. was for 128 gigabytes on the 14 Pro Max, and now it's 1449 for a 256 gigabyte 15 Pro Max. And then the highest end configuration, which is what I got, the 1 terabyte model, which is the first time I'm getting like a 1 terabyte model. It went down from 2099 for the 14 Pro Max with 1 terabyte to 1949. And always don't forget, for my US viewers, that this does account for 19% value added tax. So yeah, it's a much better deal here, much better.
Okay, we'll see you in the comparisons.
Yeah, I'll look forward to those. And now we'll get to a video I didn't like as much, which is The Verge, but they also don't have anyone with the charisma of this guy, so I mean, you take what you can get.
Technological progress is big. Sometimes it's small, but those small changes can add up to a lot, and with enough of them, incremental progress can be kind of a big deal. It also helps when EU regulators get involved and enforce a universal charging standard. That's how we ended up here. The first USB-C iPhone. That's it.
Okay. The problem is, like, maybe I should have put on iJustine's video first, because this will look like I'm like against women because I just praised the guy, and the first review with a female reviewer, I will be trashing it a little, not by a lot, but they gave the iPhones an 8 out of 10. Meanwhile, Engadget, which usually is pretty like comparable to the Verge, is giving them like a 93 and a 94, which is far more reasonable in my opinion. I think they should be like between a 9 and a 9.5. I don't think there's that much missing here, to be honest. Like maybe, like, yeah, detract as many points from the non-pros as you want. Say that phones have, in that price range, usually have 120 hertz, complain that they don't have USB 3, complain that they don't have optical zoom cameras, complain whatever you want. But with the pros, there's just not that much missing. Also, there's still nothing quite like the Pro, right? The Pro with its like 6.1 inch display, especially now with those super slim bezels, there is no comparable high-end Android phone. There are now like some Android phones ranging from like 5.8 inches to like 6.5-ish, which obviously 6.5-ish has nothing to do with the regular Pro, that have decent like processors, but they usually will have like the S23, right? By this point, that 50 megapixel sensor that they're using is pretty ancient. Like, if you're somebody who complains that they're reusing the sensor from the 14 Pro, like, boy oh boy, may I show you the Galaxy S23 and S23 Plus, and these have LTPO panels, while definitely as it appears that the S24 and 24 Plus might finally get LTPO panels, not just the Ultra, but like even the current S23 Ultra has an older generation LTPO panel than the 15 Pro Max, and the 15 Pro Max pretty much reuses the same panel from the 14 Pro Max. So Samsung was basically 2 gens behind here.
The new charging port is a big deal, but that's not the first thing you notice about the iPhone 15 Pro and the 15 Pro Max. Whether you're just taking a look or picking them up, you're gonna notice the new titanium exterior and frosted glass. It looks sleek, the sides...
The 13, like, the Pros have had frosted glass on the back. I know it's technically a little different, but it's definitely not. Like, titanium, yes, that is what you will notice, but not the frosted glass.
Have a brushed finish. It's more comfortable to hold, and most importantly, it's quite a bit lighter than the stainless steel that came before it on the Pro models. It makes the 15 Pro and Pro Max 19 grams lighter than their predecessors. Maybe that doesn't sound like a lot, but you notice it, especially on the Pro Max. That might be the thing that impacts your experience using these phones more than anything else Apple did this year. And if you want the bigger phone this year, you'll have to pay up. The 15 Pro starts at $999, but the Pro Max jumps up to $1199. You get 256 gigabytes of storage at that price, which is what it cost last year, but there's no 128 gigabyte model.
I don't actually think, like, I know obviously she is technically correct with like the but here, but I actually do not think this is a situation for buts whatsoever. I have never recommended anyone get a 128 gigabyte iPhone Pro ever. The reason for this is because iPhones usually actually had 64 gigabytes at the time that they were updated, but then if you paid more, you got 256 for $150 extra. And by the time they introduced 128 gigabytes, upgrading to 256 cost $100. So I've always recommended people with the Pro Max get 256 gigs, and people with the regular Pro to only get 128 if they really didn't care for a lot of like high intensive usage and just wanted the Pro basically for the Pro's sake. And yeah, for most people 256 has been what they always got. Many people started getting 512 and 1 terabyte given the better value in euro. I've actually bought the 1 terabyte model, so yeah, I don't consider this but anyway important whatsoever.
So that's the new starting price. There's a lot more to cover, but there's one word I've been thinking about over the past week, and that's Pro. These are the Pro models, of course, and
that's the cringy part of the video. You will see what I mean.
Apple even renamed the A17 chipset Pro. But what exactly does it mean? I mean, it's short for professional, but what's a professional phone? We've been poking fun at this since Apple started putting the word Pro on.
The fun part is that Apple has actually added a ton of Pro level features specifically in this phone generation that people were saying an iPhone 14 Pro or 13 Pro needed for proper Pro branding, right? Like they added USB-C, which is standardized, so it actually supports a ton of stuff. They've added faster USB, so external connectivity actually works well. Let me just briefly turn off. Where do I turn it off? Here. Oh, here. It's iPhone 13 Pro Max camera. And actually cannot see that. Oh, here, reactions. I'm gonna turn off reactions. So then you got so USB-C, faster USB-C. So with also like explicit like support for like recording to external storage. They have log video files now. Like they've added so much that people ask specifically for Pro functionality. I'm honestly starting to wonder if those people will never be satisfied with the Pro branding whatsoever, even as Apple deliberately adds one feature after another that they specifically asked for. This is such an old, boring joke. It takes away from so much meaningful content and discussions that we could have had. We could have talked about features such as USB-C and USB 3 like long prior any like discussion of pros or non-pros, but because for some reason like something like the XS Max branding, right, sounded funny to people, and then the 11 Pro like the XS, and then the 10, some people said, oh, it reads like XS, and then Apple introduced the Pro branding with the 11, and people were like, oh, what happens if you get like an S-year upgrade, right? And then we never got an S-year upgrade. We went from 11 to 12 to 13 to 14 to now 15, and then people were like, well, now Pro and Max sound funny. But when people are suggesting to change the name, like internally, like through leaks and rumors, when people suggest that the name would change to Ultra, people are like, well, now it will confuse consumers. And then, of course, at the heart of it all is also like, well, what does Pro actually mean? Pro means higher end. That's 100% it. There is no specific set of features that defines pro. You can be a pro writer and write erotic fan fiction on your smartphone, and you make more money than probably I will ever make as a doctor later on. This ridiculous distinction of pros or non-pros is so mind-bogglingly stupid that I honestly don't understand how in the year 2023, with what is now the 4th generation of iPhones to adopt the pro branding, literal decade after like Apple has introduced pro, like that pro chart, right, between like what consumers want, what pros want, right? Sure, that made specific sense for the Mac, because obviously you could maybe more highly distinction between the non-pros and the pro users, especially like 20 years ago when technology was highly limited and you were literally paying out of the ass to get meaningful performance upgrades, meaningful capability upgrades. But nowadays, of course, there's diminishing returns between pros and non-pros, between one gen to the next. This idea that, oh, pro means professional, nope, it does not. It simply means better. Basically, if you're a professional, which could include you being a fucking whore, which I'm very pro-sex work, but I know a lot of people would not consider that a profession in that way, even though it's considered the oldest profession in many ways. And you could make enough money to get yourself the better one, the better phone. So now you actually are utilizing your own proness to be, to get a pro phone.
Everything.
So ridiculous.
But it makes more sense if you think of it as standing for progress. We'll come back to that. Just keep it in mind for now.
That doesn't even make sense, because there is no progress between the regular and the pro phone. It's just different features that exist at the same period of time. By your logic, progress would actually be meaning every iPhone would need to be pro, because it's technically progress from the same iPhone a year ago. It does not make sense this way. Pro means better.
Let's look at one of the big new hardware features this year. Not the charging port, the action button. It's next to the volume.
I would actually say pro meaningfully more stands for something like pro and contra, right? That something speaks for this phone. And what speaks for this phone versus the regular 15 are all the pro features. This is a way better, like, I don't think you should think of this in any way except for pro means better. But if you really want to take the word pro, then think of it in like pro and contra and counter, like whatever you, however you want to. Like, I'm a little Latin coded because I've had Latin at school. But yeah, if you just want to think it in plain English, how you would usually understand it, those things are for the pro iPhones, and the regular iPhones basically don't have those things that speak for the pros. It's stupid, it's meaningless, but it is still better than her definition.
Buttons, and it takes the place of the long-standing mute switch. By default, it does the same thing as a mute switch. Long press it to turn all your sounds off, and then long press it again to turn them back on. But you can also make it do other things. Just open up the settings menu. It randomly goes really hard with these oddly mesmerizing animations.
It's beautiful.
And you can program the action button to open the camera or turn on your flashlight or trigger an accessibility feature. It can also run shortcuts, which means it can be your order me a PSL button if you want to. Just in theory. Yeah, that's it. Is it perfect? Not quite. I wish I could program it to do a secondary action when you double press it. And on the Pro Max, it's in kind of an awkward spot to reach. In the camera app, you can use it as a shutter, but it's a little weird because you feel like you're holding.
All fair, the way she outlines it, the way she covers the counters. As I've said before, there would have been better places for it. I've outlined why it is where it is, given the history of iPhone design. But it's all absolutely, like, if she had voiced it, like put it the same way she does now, I would be 100% on board with it. I didn't like the way she like primed us for this.
The camera upside down. But it's nice to be able to customize this button to do just about anything you want it to, especially since Apple isn't exactly known for customization
This is changing. I know Apple will never be as customizable as Android, but I highly encourage people to look even at Windows, which sure you can go through like 1,000 system settings and like change DLL files and stuff like that, but you will actually find it reasonably difficult to customize in a way that will not create a ton of bugs, visual issues, inconsistencies, and basically create you like a month of extra work because there's no reasonable preset to change here. So this idea that Apple is unique is not true. Yes, iOS is also more closed off, but in the way it's customizable, it's not as bad as some people make it out to be. In fact, you could say Windows regressed in many ways since the Windows Vista days when it comes to customizability.
It's, progress.
It's literally not. Yes, it is a progress over the 15 Pro, over the 14 Pro, but how would you then compare it to the 15, which is a phone from the same year? Jesus.
Okay, let's get to the port because that's something that's going to affect everyone who buys this phone. It is exactly what it looks like, a USB-C connector, just like the ones on basically every other modern Android phone. On the Pro models, it's USB 3, which enables faster transfer speeds at up to 10 gigabits per second, but you'll need that cable sold separately, of course. You can do quite a bit with it too. Plug in a hub, an SD card reader, Ethernet. Apple hasn't done a lot of its usual gatekeeping here, so most things just work how they should. Progress. Just don't plug your phone into a display and expect to run a whole desktop environment. This isn't DeX.
It's also not needed. It's like, I know some people like DeX. I have never seen somebody like use DeX in a way where they didn't go out of their way to use DeX, you know what I mean? Because I've never seen those people not be capable of like taking their laptop with them with like in a situation where they took like that desktop, that DeX puck that also cools like your phone and stuff like that. I know it can work through just one cable, but then you still need a mouse and a keyboard to make it actually look good. And then you could technically use like your phone as a trackpad. So I'm not stupid. I know how DeX works, but now at this point you are working with so many things to consider and such an unintuitive input method. It's like, oh, I have a keyboard with me and I use like my phone as a little trackpad here. It's like at this point just put in a fucking laptop or a tablet in the box. Like DeX on a Samsung tablet actually makes sense. It is essentially what Stage Manager is, and it came first, and it is more comprehensive than Stage Manager. It's absolutely something worth praising, but when people are mentioning DeX for a smartphone, I get usually a little flustered with that.
For some people, this will mean you just need to pick up an extra USB-C charging brick because you know you're not getting one in the box. But even if it's a little inconvenient right now, this is overwhelmingly a good change. You can pack one.
Why are all your
charger
iPhones
MacBook,
broken?
Your iPad, your phone, and whatever other modern devices you carry around. There's still 3 cameras on the back of both Pro phones, but one of them got an upgrade. The telephoto on the 15 Pro Max is now a 5x lens, or 120mm equivalent. The 15 Pro still has a 3x zoom, and there's nothing really new about it. The jump from 3x to 5x is a noticeable one, and it opens up some interesting possibilities for what you can do with framing and
I mean, yeah, I don't like. The problem is there are no comparison images here. The images themselves, like, they look good by all accounts. It's just they are against such a bland thing. I almost really wonder. Like, I know that not every reviewer will like drive to the beach to take beautiful pictures, and they did just show like a beautiful cliffside. But there's a lot more that you can get of this phone than those pictures, and this to me always shows that unless you're looking at something older than like an iPhone 10, I would argue that the quality of the photographer matters way more than the quality of the actual phone's ability to capture photos. It's just that once you normalize it for your own talent, then you can start getting better things, but especially once you also better understand what the actual camera is capable of.
compression that you don't really get with a shorter lens. This is Apple's first attempt at a long telephoto lens, and it's a good one. There's plenty of detail and good lighting and the sensor shift stabilizer, which also does double.
Okay, so she did actually have some beach photos from New York. I guess it's no. Is it the Golden Gate Bridge? Because the color is this way. I always assume for some reason that the Verge operates out of New York, but I guess that's not a necessity. Well, it does look like the Golden Gate, doesn't it?
Autofocus seems to help in dim light. Things get a little muddy in low light, but it's a small sensor, so that's not too surprising. Apple's really playing catch up here. The Pixel 7 Pro has a 5x zoom, and Samsung has put 10x zoom cameras on its phones for years. But overall, I like the...
Again, no meaningful comparison shots. No nothing. I like, even if they were like, if their final conclusion was like Apple's 5x sucks against Pixels, at least you would have fucking tested it. This no mention of other phones is so meaningless. It's what I always say about like the 10x. A lot of the situations she tested out here with like the haze and everything, right, the fog and stuff like that, it would be terrible for the 10x zoom. The 10x zoom has a smaller sensor than either the 3x or the 5x. It has a way worse aperture than those ones, and it's paired with an older chip. Well, it's not that old, the Snapdragon 8 Gen 2, right, but it's not the A17 Pro. So there's a lot that is working against it here, and like this is the same way when Samsung first introduced like their 100 and later 200 megapixel sensors, and they had like focus problems, and people were still like, oh, but it's sharper technically, and like, yeah, it's sharper if something is in focus, which is hard to often do. And then it took them like 7 months to fix that on like the Galaxy S20 Ultra. It's like, this is why I actually really like Super Saf for this. He does really good, really fair comparisons. Usually when he does a test, I don't care if the iPhone wins. I know that he will give it a fair shot. It's just usually when those other websites do some of the testing, then I know they will get like fixated on something like this zooms out further instead of the actual quality considerations. Sometimes they will test it out in perfect lighting conditions, and I'm like, and then do one series of photos on one day, and then like make conclusions based on that. This is not representative data.
This 5x lens on the 15 Pro Max. The 2x crop on the main camera is good enough for shorter telephoto shots, so a dedicated 3x lens feels a little redundant. You don't get the wow factor of something like Samsung's 10x lens, but it's
I was never wowed by this. Sorry. If it had been a variable zoom between like 5x and 10x, I would have been like, mwah. I might have actually bought the S23 Ultra, which I actually thought of doing because they actually had some really good discounts at first. But then I didn't buy it in those first early weeks. Then the price went up, and that was unfortunately where I would say I'm not paying 1,500 euro for a phone, which was like 1,600 for like a 512 gigabyte phone that I will be like more or less replacing with the next iPhone anyway.
Becca will have another video coming out soon, diving deeper into all of that, so stay tuned.
I honestly don't like it. Look at how Mrwhosetheboss did. He made some actual definitive statements. He made some interesting, like knowledge-worthy, like comparisons where it's when it comes to how the different like lens variants behave and stuff like that. This is just giving an extremely broad overview, not even a review of it, and then like trying to sell it as a review. There's a reason why I'm not covering MKBHD. MKBHD did a second impressions video. He did not do a review because he said a review after 6 days is not up to his standards. Well, guess what, The Verge? If you cannot manage it in a similar way like Mrwhosetheboss did, who himself said, well, for now I do believe battery is better, but I'll be giving you detailed breakdowns afterwards. For now, I believe the camera is definitely better across basically every camera, thanks to like the new algorithms, the new processor, but I will be doing very detailed breakdowns afterwards. Superstaff did like a I believe he also called it like a second impressions, and he also promised like tomorrow or the day after that a comparison with like Samsung and stuff like that. So them promising this but without any meaningful conclusions in their review is really bad journalistic practice.
For now, I'm happy with the changes Apple made here. Feels like a much more flexible system with the new zoom options, and I find myself taking more shots that I would have otherwise skipped without the long telephoto lens. That's the big news.
Yeah, and this is actually a decent conclusion amidst a ton of like super vague stuff. Why not actually do a show some comparison stuff while you're talking
On the
about
hardware
this?
front,
I know there is some stuff on like the Verge website, but this has to be in the video, guys. This has to be in the video.
the 48 megapixel camera and the ultra wide are basically unchanged from the 14 Pro. But there are a few interesting things happening in the software too. There are new 28mm and 35mm modes for the main camera. You can cycle between them by tapping the one-time zoom option. These aren't the result of basic digital zoom up-resing. Apple actually has a separate processing pipeline for each of them. You can even change the default focal length to 28 or 35 if 24 feels too wide to you. And I know several of you who are going to do that immediately when you get this phone. Another neat update is that you can apply portrait mode to certain photos after you take them now. Anytime the camera detects a person, a cat, a dog, or whenever you tap to focus in the frame, a little f-stop icon appears on the screen to let you know that it's saving depth information. When you edit in the Photos app, you can turn the portrait effect on and even change the focus point. This is a huge victory for anyone who's ever struggled switching modes while your pet or your kid does something cute and you totally miss the moment. So there are some changes in video mode too. Take it away.
Again, like no conclusions in for real. Like it's like she breaks down those features pretty well, but I've broken down all those features. To me, all of this without meaningful comparisons and without meaningful like anecdotes in terms of like, well, for me it helped with this and this photo taking habit and something like that. This is why you take a little longer. It could be a much better review. I'm not hating here. I'm honestly like doing the parent thing, which is I'm not angry, I'm disappointed.
Baby.
Hello. So, this year on the iPhone 15 Pro and the Pro Max, you have the ability to shoot in log, meaning that you can record video without a color profile baked into your footage. Why does that matter? Because folks like me, video creators, can take advantage of more dynamic range, and they can easily manipulate colors and match them to other cameras too. So yeah, this is what log looks like. It looks flat, there's no color, no over-sharpening.
There's color, but it's as close to black and white as you basically get.
Here, so, little transition. So in order to do what I just did, you would have to use a desktop app like Premiere or DaVinci or Apple's own Final Cut Pro. There will be
a small add-on. I guess maybe they had like beta access to whatever Final Cut, like to a new Final Cut version. We just got updates for both the iPad and the macOS version of Final Cut, and I do finally want for Apple to just like I will subscribe to the $5 a month thing if they make it a universal thing between iPad and Mac. I'm not buying both things separately. I'm not buying the Mac app and subscribing to the iPad.
be support for Final Cut Pro on the iPad and other apps as well. And you can download Apple's provided LUTs from their developer website, right? Let's go back and edit some footage. Okay, a few things that you should know. In order to film in log, you can only film in ProRes, and those files can get pretty large. Our review unit of the phone has 1 terabyte of storage, which gives you a little over 150 or 160 minutes of filming, but hey, we have USB-C port now, so you can just connect an external drive for as much storage as you need. Actually, you'll have to record straight into an SSD drive if you want to shoot past 4K 30s, meaning 4K 60.
I'm actually disappointed with that. I usually don't like restrictions that require accessories that are not easily baked in, right? Something like well, I don't like limitations at all, to be honest. When you look at something like how I'm using my iPhone 13 Pro Max right now as a camera with my Mac, like I have like that MagSafe puck from Belkin that attaches to it, but I could still like I could have put up a tripod for all it mattered right at the same spot, and it would be working in a very similar way right now. Maybe the MacBook would be a little more in the way, but that still would be fine. I don't like having no ability to record 4K 60 ProRes RAW. Or 4K 60 ProRes, because I do kind of like playing around with those modes. And why would I would I get an SSD for like that? It's a little shame. Do you know what I'm saying here?
Everything else, 24 and 30, will work straight onto the device. I love having an option to shoot ProRes log on the phone. If you're on an Apple device with an M1 chip or an M2 chip, editing these will actually be super breezy because there's a dedicated ProRes accelerator. And the results are really good. And just to be clear, ProRes and log don't magically make your footage much better.
ProRes looks better than H.265, but it's not that meaningful because ProRes also, as far as I understand, it forgoes some extra computation that makes H.265 look a little better because there's just so much data. Apple does not have quite the same processing headroom, but like just the nature of capturing so much from the raw sensor, it gives it a lot of leeway. Again, Apple does not have the same obviously computational overhead between still photography and videography, so it really shows when they sometimes, like I would say that Pro RAW often will not do that much for you at all, while ProRes will have a bigger change. So yeah, I mean, you still can take it or leave it. I mean, you're limited to 4K 30. I don't know that many people who like to capture 30 FPS. I do prefer 60, to be honest.
You'll still get similar performance out of the cameras when it comes to things like noise, but having that flexibility,
I found noise to be better on ProRes
is awesome. And I think this is the part where I declare progress.
By the way, when I said like ProRAW does not make as big of a difference as ProRes, I was referring to phones where ProRAW, basically the 13 Pro, where ProRAW is limited to obviously 12 megapixels, the same resolution as the regular one, because the sensor is only 12 megapixel. Obviously something on like the 14 Pro, where you can only get 48 megapixel through ProRAW, that is a very different discussion.
Not the other pro word, professional. Apple being Apple, the camera interface didn't change here. You won't get the professional user interface where you can manually set shutter, ISO, and white balance. For that, you'll have to wait for some more third-party apps, which we're told will support log filming. Progress. Lastly, log doesn't work in cinematic mode, which I guess is to be expected, but it does work on all three separate sensors. There are no gotcha moments here. And overall, I'm impressed with how much you can do here, especially with the main lens. Things do sort of fall apart with the 5x zoom. There's just a bit too much noise in low light, and there's this overall crunchiness in the image, even with sufficient light. But the main lens in ProRes log has pleasantly surprised me. All right, Allison, you're next. Progress. Progress.
There's a grab bag of other updates worth mentioning, like the new 17 Pro chipset. You heard that right. It's not the 17 Bionic, it's the 17 Pro, because, you know, it features a brand new GPU that enables hardware-based ray tracing so you can enjoy console-quality gaming on your phone, which is honestly really impressive. Personally, I don't think Resident Evil Village is for me, more of a SimCity girl, but yeah, it looks really good. Our new old friend.
A little criticism to professional news sites. You will actually have a benefit that most YouTubers, especially like single person YouTubers, don't have whatsoever, which is you can leverage people that have different tastes and different priorities. Now, while I would say that my interests line up pretty much perfectly with a new iPhone launch, I will have to admit that something like analyzing log video files is beyond my scope of a good understanding at the very least. So what happens then if you're talking about gaming with a potentially major breakthrough for smartphone gaming, and you basically leave it at the 10 seconds and saying, well, Resident Evil is not for me, it's like, I don't know what to say about it. You really had nobody more interested in gaming than you are? Even the guy who like recorded like the video capture part is like, what? Like, really? You couldn't have asked anyone with a little more interest?
Dynamic Island is still here, and more third-party apps like DoorDash are coming on board soon. Apple isn't making any claims of improved battery life, just that it'll get through a full day of use. We've been putting the Pro Max through a lot, and I did get through an entire day with lots of video recording, but the battery was right down to the single digits that night. We noticed a lot of complaints from 14 Pro owners saying that their maximum battery
Jesus, everybody mentions this. It's a Twitter story. It's a Twitter only story that then YouTubers picked up. It's literally not been corroborated by quality journalism or anything. Like, if you really worry that much, you're the fucking Verge. Go to a chemist, ask him if there's, or her, like, I don't want to be sexist because I'm angry. Ask that person if they believe that there's any chemical reason for why this is worse than the 13 Pro even, and then make statements. Don't just copy paste stuff from X. And I say X because I'm angry, because it's Twitter. Steve French, hey buddy, can you answer a question for me? Sure I can, bud.
battery capacity is degraded from 100 to 90% or even lower just in 1 year, which is
which is absolutely in line with lithium-ion expectations that usually degrade down to 80% after 2 years.
pretty concerning.
It's not. It's really not. It's 100% wrong. Whatever she's saying right now, it's absolutely wrong.
Apple hasn't mentioned any improvements to overall battery health, so that might be something to look out for on the 15 Pro. There's a new ultra-wideband chip, so you can find your stuff or your friends with more precision.
Technically, it's more about being further away before the ultra wideband jumps in. If you actually like run around the room looking for stuff that you want to locate through U1 chip, you'll find you have to be pretty close, like by 4-5 meters or something like that, before it actually turns it on. I've seen it go further. It will depend on there's something in the line of sight, basically. And this is supposed to be like a 3 times further. I don't remember the concrete stuff. I can just tell you what I remember from the U1 from experience.
They have an iPhone 15 or one of the new Apple Watches too, and that they want you to know where they are. Apple's adding roadside assistance to the
Steve, you wanted to ask a question? I don't see anything.
emergency SOS roster, and we're still waiting to find out how much that emergency satellite service is bundled with is going to cost.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting point. It's very weird to put that in the end, because you probably didn't have much else where you could put it, though it makes it look like some kind of extortionist practice. Like Apple partnered with a satellite service provider to give you 2 years of paid for coverage. Now, the one thing that where I disagree with Apple is, while I don't actually think it should be paid for in perpetuity, what I think it should be is, in my opinion, you should have a guarantee of access, so your safety is basically always provided for. If you have to pay a little extra afterwards, that is 100% a-okay with me. If it results in me saving my life, that's perfect. I think it will also help prevent somebody from activating the feature for fun or something like that later on. So to me, the question is not how much it costs, but will there be a guarantee? Will I not have to enable any kind of satellite service subscription, which I would hate. So you understand what I'm saying? I do think that access would probably be guaranteed. I mean, it's kind of like roaming in another country, right? You can activate it no matter how much it costs. It's just, this is where my mind would be like, clear and safe basically on this issue, not how much it costs afterwards. Even though, by the way, I assume the costs might be pretty high given what those satellite services cost to maintain.
In the meantime, iPhone 15 owners will get 2 free years of access.
The same as the
Apple
14.
wants us to believe that the 15 Pro represents a kind of technological progress that will open up new possibilities.
Apple has not said that. Apple outlines every year how individual changes in the phone can either dramatically improve or from the ground up change certain behaviors you have with technologies or how you interact with technology. This idea that Apple is selling you here a revolution in a way that they don't every year anyway is just as ridiculous as this fixation on why is it pro and oh, it's progress.
And push boundaries. I think for most of us, it's just progress. It's the next thing that's a little better than the last. Sometimes in significant ways, but mostly in small ways. I can list a handful of things that weren't on the 14 Pro that I appreciate having here. Nothing huge, but plenty of small conveniences that I'm enjoying. That's not as exciting as a big leap forward, but sometimes that's just what progress looks like.
Yeah, a cringe progress thing. I'll just briefly move into the iJustine video. I don't think we will have as many videos covered. I prepared 5. We might get to Dave2D afterwards, and then I might keep the petapixel review up for a camera review analysis when I will be able to react to Superstaff and whatever testing Mrwhosetheboss will also do separate for just the cameras. But for now, let's look at another generalized review, which is iJustine, which even though the name of this channel used to be iMark, I'm not a huge fan of iJustine actually, which again would mean I'm now criticizing another blonde woman, but I will criticize her for very different things. I actually like Justine very much as what it looks like as a nice person, but her review style is way too superficial for me. But then again, I am a nerd, so I'm probably not her main audience.
Is the brand new iPhone 15 Pro and Pro Max.
She's loud.
While everyone likes to joke that it's the same phone as last year, you'd be wrong.
It's really not. You know, like that guy who is getting a new shirt that looks exactly like the shirt that he's wearing for his birthday. Like this meme, I cannot remember a single year. Like maybe you could, well, between like something like the 7 and the 8, right? But then the 10 was the actual main attraction, and then the 8 also had like definitive updates, like the A11 chip, the glass back, wireless charging, stuff like that. Maybe 10 to 10s. But the A12 is so much better than the A11 that it's actually meaningfully different in how it performs and how the camera works in a lot of ways. Then the 11 had way better battery life. I guess you could make the point for like between the iPhone 13 and the iPhone 14, not the Pros. I guess that could be construed as like very small upgrades. I think between the 12 and 13 you still got nice stuff, but I don't consider any of that, to be honest, as meaningless as getting the same shirt every year.
Wrong.
Especially if prices are not going up. What actually is there to complain about?
Especially for photographers and videographers, it is so hard to even call this a phone. With the introduction of USB-C for fast data transfer, the new 5x telephoto, and ProRes log, it just so happens that my camera can make phone calls. The camera, of course, is where the new iPhone 15 Pro shines, but also this new titanium finish that comes in natural, black, white, and blue titanium. I've got the new natural color right here and also the blue, and they are just so stunning.
Oh, the blue looks so good where it goes like glossy, which I don't like the glossiness usually, but that way bends the light is so good. And yeah, the gray looks good. What I don't like about the natural look is the gray. I kind of believe they should have kept the natural titanium with a fully white back. I think this would have looked the best, and well, it wouldn't have looked better than this, but just the way it would be like less prone to fingerprint smudges. It wouldn't scratch in a way, right? Because this isn't anodized. If you like scratch it deep enough, you will show like actual titanium instead of the color. So I think if this was white, this could have like convinced me. Steve, you're asking if I like you. I don't know you, but I like every supporter of mine.
Like the way that they reflect the light, so beautiful. The thing that is also really surprising is how light they are compared to the previous version. It's only a slight weight.
I appreciate your support. I should be saying more in detail. I don't think I can say, like, if you like me, I assume you like my content, right?
Difference, but with these new rounded edges, it has an all new feel to it. Now, if you have an Apple Watch Ultra, this new natural titanium is a perfect match. Another huge design change is it now finally has USB-C. The Pro models will support up to USB-C
I mean, that's not actually a design change, but okay.
speeds that are 20 times faster than the regular iPhone 15. This is because of the all-new A17 Pro chip for enhanced performance. So they've now made an action button on the iPhone 15 Pros. This used to be where the silent switch was, but now you can actually customize this button to do basically whatever you want. You can still have it silence your iPhone if you choose to, but you can select from focus modes, camera options, flashlights, voice memo, magnifier. You can create custom shortcuts, accessibility, or you can have it do nothing, which is kind of pointless. I don't know why you would even select that. I have mine set up to access the camera since that's
probably like for anybody who's like might have some kind of neurological neurodegenerative disease, maybe, where you are prone to misclicking stuff, and you already have problems managing the buttons as you already have. Steve, no sexual questions in chat. And
pretty
no,
much what
I'm
I
not
use my
one.
phone for. You can even use the action button as a shutter button. The display has slightly thinner borders, dynamic island is back, and ProMotion on the Pros give you a super smooth animation. You can choose from the 6.1 inch or the 6.7 inch sizes, but the Max version is the only camera that has the 5x zoom. Now, speaking of 5x zoom, this new tech in the telephoto is called Tetraprism, and this uses a series of mirrors to reflect and magnify to keep the camera lens much smaller. That's one of the things that we always joke about. Each year the camera bumps get larger and larger. So using this Tetraprism, this allows for you to keep the camera bumps much smaller and they don't have to be increased in size.
Guys,
but
there
yet
isn't
we
that
still get
much more that
5x
I will
magnification.
say over iJustine, because it is a
So here
very
in Canada,
generalized
there's this
review.
old
I will
casino,
just
and it's now
sometimes
turned into
be
a museum and a dive
critical
shop,
when
and
she
we're up here on the hill,
says
and I'm gonna show
something
you
too
guys a little demo
superficial.
of the zoom
Or I
that
will
we have
praise her
on
when
the new
she actually
15
goes
Pro
into
Max
detail.
only. It'll go up to 5x, but the main camera now also can act as 3 lenses, a 24, a 28, and a 35 millimeter. So when you click through on the 1x, you'll be able to see those change just like this. My favorite demo though is going from the wide angle all the way into the
Steve, if you weren't asking that kind of question, then I apologize for misconstruing it that way, because I'm definitely not one what you're asking, regardless of what context.
5x. This really shows you the perspective that you're able to get. This is equivalent to 120 millimeter focal length. Pretty far out, dude. The new phone.
It's actually there's one thing interesting worth covering here, which is she outlined a relatively smooth move in and out experience between like 5x all the way to 1 or even 0.5x. I would actually say this is probably the least smooth experience that you've seen on an iPhone thus far, because the range is so big. I know it will look a little stuttery, but there is so much that Apple has to do to make that zoom or zoom out work well. It's kind of insane. Like, you have to understand, like, we've had like something like the iPhone 10 that had a 1x camera and a 2x camera, so there wasn't that much change there. And then once you had like the iPhone 11 Pro, then you had like 0.5x, 1x, 2x, 2.5x on like the 12 Pros, the 12 Pros, right? And then like 3x on the 13 Pros. So you had like a reasonable thing here going on in the range. But here now 5x is now 10x versus obviously 0.5x. It's 12 millimeters versus 120. So that's a huge difference in like real world results. And no, Steve, I am incapable of building a time machine, unfortunately, because Apple turned off that feature on the Apple Watch. Previously I had a time machine, now I don't have one.
To Catalina to test them out diving. They are water and dust resistant up to 6 meters for 30 minutes, but I use this new Oceanic Plus housing, which will let you turn your phone into a dive computer and also capture videos and photos up to 196 feet. Now, I have a full review on this housing in another video, but it is so incredible. Now, most of this video footage that you're seeing here, I shot in 4K 60 because this lets me slow down the footage in post if I see a fast fishy or if I'm floating around too fast.
That's actually not a bad point to bring up. I have been an advocate for Apple giving us 4K 120, even if it comes at a lower bitrate or something like that, because that would allow us to then meaningfully like use slow motion. Up to 5x would still be like meaningful, because then it would be 24 FPS, or 4x. Then it would be 30 FPS. So this is why while I'm not a fan of 8K, I can understand a little bit of the value of 8K, because 8K would allow you to zoom in. One would allow you to like zoom in time basically, and the other would allow you to zoom in on detail.
In a current. Oceanic Plus is the same app that was launched last year with the Apple Watch Ultra to let you turn your Apple Watch into a dive computer. So it is so cool that you can now do this with your iPhone. I love testing out taking photos and videos all around Catalina. My favorite thing we shot though was this Wes Anderson style TikTok meme video using the ProRes log, and I'm so happy with how it turned out. Behind the scenes of our Wes Anderson TikTok vertical content. Shooting in log is really cool because it gives you so much more flexibility in editing with color, and it also can save some highlights if it's a super bright day. So let's test them out and see what we got.
Okay, she does do ProRes log colored, which again, it is like your personal interpretation. It is not obviously designed to be like ProRes log colored can look basically however you want it to. There is no meaningful comparison without like zooming in to see if like capturing in log potentially reduced noise or something like that.
I also didn't realize that you can shoot in ProRes on the front-facing camera. So right now, shooting ProRes, front-facing camera. Now the thing with ProRes though is it is going to increase your file sizes, which is one of the reasons why this feature is specifically on the Pros. Now if I want to shoot in 4K 60, this is where a little notification pops up and it says ProRes not supported, but it will be supported when recording to external storage. Now I'm gonna try recording externally to this little OWC drive. This is
Man, like I know USB-C has been like available for years, but I actually believe that this will be such a huge boom to like completely random USB-C accessories as people rush out to test what even works with USB-C, as people copy what YouTubers are doing with USB-C. Like quite honestly, if USB-C was like a licensed thing, then it would be bringing now incredible money towards that license holder. It just so happens to be open, thankfully.
1 terabyte. So we're going to switch this into the ProRes log and to 60 frames a second, plug it in, and it's time to record. I was also super impressed with how well this shot videos at nights. Here's a demo of a shot that was shot in log, and here is one that's just regular. And you can kind of see here in the lights how it's saved a little more detail and it's less blown out around the light.
Again, she has been a little superficial thus far, but I genuinely like this. This is where obviously her passions collide the most, right? She is passionate about technology in general, but she obviously is a YouTuber. She is like somebody who engages with video creation. This is where she gets the most excited. And yeah, I also kind of assume though that the way Apple like pushes ProRes log here will also encourage Mac purchases for a lot of beginning filmmakers, I would say. Not really in the realm of like super professional stuff, but you know, like your amateur productions that are deliberately made with a smartphone. So I do believe that there is quite good value here.
Night mode also got a little boost as well. So here's a few photos.
Also, like, really convenient to think that you could like charge your phone and put your data somewhere. I assume that those accessories would be able to like also charge your phone simultaneously. I mean, if it really doesn't work, then you like get a super long extension cable connected to a MagSafe puck and put that on the back. That could lead to overheating, but it is still a way to like use a port and charge it. That's kind of how I would solve it if necessary. And then you would need to have some cooling on it, but then cooling could interfere with audio. So there is some other stuff here to consider.
That I took handheld on the 15. You can see all of the detail here, especially in the 5x zoom, is pretty impressive. This is a difficult shot because there's like a lot of light, but there's also not a lot of light. So testing out the new iPhone 15 Pro camera system because it is newer and it is the latest and the greatest and it's the best iPhone that Apple has ever made. I like to kind of test them out in comparison to the previous version. Let's see if we can tell the difference. We're gonna get ice cream. This is how you properly do an iPhone review.
Yeah, like there's a lot of focus on the camera here, like almost zero, and like I know she will get to some more stuff, but like the ratio is a little off to me.
There's a few new Pro options now that you can quickly access here in the top menu. Now you do need to first turn these on in the settings. Now when you're in the camera, you can press to hold and quickly switch.
I don't agree with that. I don't like when you have to go into settings to turn something on to then turn it on in the camera app. I will do it. It obviously doesn't bother me, but I think it prevents some people from like even learning what their phone is capable of. And then encourage them to learn more in the future.
Between the options as needed. I shot most of my photos just in normal mode and in RAW max. The HEIF mode will give you a higher resolution image.
I have now heard so many pronunciations of HEIF, like HEIF, HEIF, HEIF. It's pretty insane.
At a much smaller file size, but since I have the 1 terabyte phone, I just shot in the Pro Max resolution for most of my photos when I wasn't shooting in the normal. It's golf cart time. This is my favorite part about Catalina, is renting a golf cart and going and exploring the island.
There's a lot of non-relevant. Is that even B-roll at that point? It's like C-roll.
action mode isn't something new, but it's still so impressive. You can also see in this demo here that we're on a super bouncy golf.
Yeah, I actually forget that sometimes, that I technically don't have action mode. iPhone videos have always been pretty well stabilized given the time when they came out. Obviously, if you look at something like the iPhone 6, it would suck by modern standards. Yeah, I usually forget that because I've never been unhappy with my 13 Pro Max when it comes to stabilization. And I do still think that given the nature of how you hold your phone, right? If you move your hands up and down this way, there is no legitimate way for your phone to know if it like should stay a little zoomed in on a certain part of the image, or if you really wanted to move your hands up, right? The only way it could really tell is with a small delay. So the only way to really stabilize this is what she also had for her like Oceanic Plus thing, which stabilizes your phone in place with two hands, far more stable than anything you do one-handed. It's also what Apple showed, or something similar to what Apple showed with like their like filmmaker grade accessories, not by Apple directly, but what they've shown in the video for it. So yeah, action mode is great. I just wouldn't bet on anything this small ever working as well as something this big, right?
Golf cart, and it's able to really stabilize that footage so much better, and it made it super smooth. These were also shot in log, so here's what it looks like before the color, and here's what it looks like after. I'm not gonna lie, I don't really shoot that much in cinematic mode normally, but when I do,
it also
I'm
sucks
always
on the
so impressed
13
with how
Pro.
great it looks. So now cinematic mode supports digital zoom from 1x to 3x. So you can tap 1 or 2, and then you can use the scroll wheel to go all the way up to 3. Now in regular video, you can do this as well, but all the way up to 15. Something else I noticed
this
is
actually
how
will line up with what I've said prior. Look,
the zoom is. So when you're using the scroll wheel,
did you see the small stutter? Is it adjusted to the 5x perspective? This is definitely like not super smooth by Apple standards. It just so happens that with the difference between 1x and 2x and 5x, there's really no good way to do it. Like, I'm sure they could be if they like took like 2 years to just fine-tune the algorithm just for this, but every year they also upgrade their sensors, their lens stuff, and which makes that thing also impossible. And then I assume once we get something like variable zoom, then we are in an entirely different discussion as well.
you can really fine-tune your zoom and get as close or as far away from your subject as you like. I love being able to go in and edit in cinematic mode, so when you're in here, as you tap on something on the screen as you're playing the video, it'll change the focus from whichever point of interest that you want it to focus on. So as you'll see here, I've tapped on my face.
This is actually something that I assume maybe not in the most standard mode, but will eventually come to iPhones by default. Right, this is like in cinematic mode. Similar to how you now take portraits while taking regular photos, I assume at some point you will be able to take video with depth data just by default. Obviously, that does incur a computational like penalty, but if you have like potentially a chip that is like twice as fast again in terms of its image signal processing capabilities, then maybe that will be enough, right?
And then I've tapped back here on the background, and now it's focusing not on me, it's focusing more in the background. And as you continue through on this timeline, this gives you the ability to reshoot.
Yes, Steve, I put you in
It's
timeout.
also great because if you do bring a cinematic clip into Final Cut, you can do the same
But
action
glad
and
you
change
stayed.
the focal point there as well. Obviously for me, testing out photos and video is my favorite thing, but a few of the other updates is the new wireless tech. With the new 2nd gen ultra wideband chip, this enables precision finding for friends. Now this is of course only if your friend wants to be found, but when you turn this on, it'll give you precise turn-by-turn directions of getting to your friend, much like when you're trying to find your AirPods. So I love gaming, and they are really
Chai, very
turning
glad
this
you
phone
can
into
join
a
us.
console-level gaming device.
We actually
With the new
have,
A7
like, you're joining us late, but we actually will have a couple more videos, or like we have at least one more video after that, so please consider staying playing even though you're joining a little late. And Steve, you can put me in timeout if you ever make a video I want to watch live and then I'm on your channel, you can put me in timeout.
Pro chip, this is giving performance improvements for games like mesh shading and hardware accelerated ray tracing. I also really like that I can charge my AirPods or Apple Watch using the charge port, and since it's USB-C, this is a great time to pick yourself up a nice pink iJustine USB-C cable to go with it. PinkIJustineCables.com. Shameless plug. Roadside assistance.
Probably USB 2-speed cables though, right? Like, not gonna lie, I don't see now a lot of point in like USB 2.0 like separate cables. At this point, just spend a little extra for something faster. And do mean I don't see a point in USB 2.0. I think I've said accidentally USB 3.0. Yes, Steve, I do timeout when it's deserved.
It's also been added to the satellite emergency offering using AAA, which I actually have AAA, so hyped about that. This is pretty great if you get a flat tire or you break down and you need help. I've definitely been there, so it is nice to know that you can use the satellite for more than just a super emergency situation. So all in all, I have been loving the new phone, and of course, if you do already have an iPhone 14 Pro device, this isn't going to be like some huge, massive overhaul physically, but if you are super into video, the new zoom and the ability to shoot and log is...
Quite honestly, I don't think I can recommend upgrading from the 14 Pro to the 15 Pro. Just the fact that it has the exact same camera hardware almost. Yeah, sure, the performance uplift is nice, but by the time you really need extra performance, why wouldn't you just get something that has an A18 Pro at that point? I am upgrading from the 13 Pro, and I will probably be upgrading from the 15 Pro to the 16 Pro, but that will have different reasons. I'm not just will be upgrading from upgrading sakes. I have like an agreement with somebody in my family that I'm buying this gen, then they're getting my old phone at that point, and obviously then I will have to buy myself a 16 Pro.
So awesome. I love the new titanium finish and how light it is. It just feels so nice in your hand. It's fast with all of the added iOS 17 features. It definitely does feel like a really great upgrade. I have a bunch of other Apple videos here if you want to check them out after this. Thank you guys for watching, and let me know what your favorite color iPhone is this season.
Yeah, again, not a bad video. I haven't talked about it as much as I've done some other videos, but yeah, it is a little like superficial in some way. Yeah, anybody coming from an iPhone 4S, it's kind of time to upgrade. Let me look at, yes, this is the one I wanted to react to next. I don't think I will have time for the petapixel camera review. Maybe, who knows, maybe if a lot more people join. But I would definitely like to react to Dave2D. If otherwise I won't have time afterwards, then I will react to the petapixel video once guys like Supersaf and Mrwhosetheboss have like deliberate camera reviews.
Okay, Apple's iPhone 15s. We're looking at all four
The audio quality ain't that great.
devices here. We have the iPhone 15,
It's like mono.
the 15 Plus, the 15 Pro, and the 15 Pro Max. Having spent a few days with these devices, there's so much more to talk about than I'd originally thought. Let's start off here with the 15 and the 15 Plus. So both of these devices have an aluminum build still. They're roughly the same size and shape as the previous generation. The biggest difference aesthetically is going to be the rounded edges. Now, if you look at Apple's marketing material, they do such a good job selling it, right? It makes it look like they've created some aluminum pillow for your hand. It looks so smooth and soft in the imagery. It does look really good. Apple did a fantastic job making these new iPhones look just distinctly iPhone. This is the new rounded edge design, and they have that design language right now. No one else is doing it. And the same thing goes with the Pro devices. These have the same rounded edges as the non-Pro, and they just look so cool. I feel like the design language on this is nice, especially...
It reminds me a little bit of the iPhone 4, like with the way the stainless steel looked on there, and the way, like Steve Jobs said, it looks like an old Leica camera. It has a lot of the same appeal. Oh wait, this is an 18-minute video. I usually expect Dave2D to be really concise. It's interesting. I wonder if he has a lot to contribute. Maybe he will do like a lot of performance testing. His video is the one I haven't watched.
That nice titanium color, but the moment you case it, the design language is kind of lost. Now, in terms of the materials, the iPhone 15 and 15 Plus have that aluminum rail on the side, but they also have a new satin finish glass back.
Yes, while the previous ones were glossy, on the Pros, the previous one was already like satin-like.
And during the presentation, they're like, this is some color-infused glass material, and I was like, what?
This does like the colors are so
What's so
freaking
special
muted.
about that? But I realized this isn't just regular glass. This is, I mean, it's a derivative of Gorilla Glass, right? So colored Gorilla Glass is very uncommon, and I thought, why would they even do this? Like, what was wrong with the previous iteration of the iPhone, right? So this is the iPhone 14, and it's just a glass back, and the way that they color it is they just add a colored layer on the bottom of it, and then just the color goes through that.
Yeah, I look, I understand the material advantages of doing what they did. I'm just saying currently the end result is meaningfully worse than the last generation. I actually like the pink. So if they maybe next year could like double on the color there while keeping that new material process, that would be kind of the best case scenario.
See-through glass, right? Why not just run this? And I honestly, the only thing I can think of, like the only thing that I think is like, okay, maybe this is why, is that if you have colored glass, you get to vary the kind of intensity of the color based on the thickness of the glass. So on this portion of it, where there's like a thin layer of glass, it's like a faint pink, but then when you have it on the camera hump, so it's
It
a
looks
thicker layer
really,
of glass,
really good.
it's just a more intense color because there's just more of those color particles in it. And it's kind of neat, but I'm like,
It's
I
not
don't
worth
know.
the trade-off
It seems-
currently.
It seems a little strange that they focused on this thing, but I guess that's what they were going for. Now, the colors are really pale. When I started the event, I was like, those look pretty muted, but in person, the blue looks like it's like this, it almost looks white, right?
It looks completely white to me. I assume Dave2D have 25% of guys has a similar level of color blindness as I do. I literally see white on the satin finish. I do see a tint of blue here, but if you told me this was just a white iPhone and there was like maybe a tiny hint of blue, maybe from some reflection from the wall or something, I would 100% believe you.
a very cool looking white color, but all the colors this year are almost pastel. The Pro device.
Yeah, I guess you could also make that point, right? That it's a cool white, which obviously blue is a cool color, which I guess kind of how eggshell has like a little bit of yellow. But I've never seen like, I've seen one thing that is eggshell that I've tried to like see the tiny bits of yellow in, and I couldn't. And that was one of my best friend's car. And then everything else in real world that I've ever seen that was eggshell, I could tell the yellow tint in it, or just a warm tint, you could say. While here in the blue, like this is not blue, this is white blue, white too, or whatever, or blight.
Have a titanium rail, and these look really nice to me. So they have like a brushed finish to them. It's very subtle. You kind of have to put it like right up to the camera to see, but I think it looks really cool.
It looks really
I will
good.
say that the fingerprints on the natural color don't show up very readily. Like it's very good at hiding fingerprints, but the black device, this shows up more.
I don't like his haircut. He used to have much better hair.
This, yeah, you can see it right here. Like you can just see the kind of greasy smudges on it. Also, I've noticed that sometimes like the buttons, the area around the buttons, it just kind of builds up, kind of like smudgy stuff. But these are just little details. I only bring this up because I feel like because this is the flagship device and
Yeah, I kind of don't know if there's a way to, well, maybe once we go fully haptic buttons, maybe that will not be an issue anymore. But yeah, it happens. It also happens like around the way the steel covers the lenses, right? There it gets like smudgy and even dirty in a way that you almost cannot clean, which is a bummer.
flagship material, some people just really care. And I thought I'd just share
I care. To do the Luke from Star Wars things, I care.
my quick experiences with it. But I do think that this, like the natural titanium, man, this is such a nice looking color.
I wish this was just white. I'm not a fan of like an overall gray aesthetic. Maybe it could grow on me in person. I definitely like how it looks where it's like glossy and not like the satin finish. Though the satin stuff does kind of very nicely transition to the titanium chassis. Maybe I'll have to check those colors out later at like the Apple store. But yeah, I'm happy with my blue purchase. The only thing I'm not happy with is that I don't have a color matched Apple Watch and a color matched iPhone. Theonchai, you agree that shorter haired Dave looked far better. I agree. Steve, you can upgrade to an iPhone 5. It's still better than an iPhone 4S.
Everything about this metal just vibes with me. I mean, look at me. I have a gray set. Like, I love everything gray. Even my watch is gray, right? When was the last time you saw an all gray phone? They're not common. The last one I had, I think, was like the Samsung Galaxy S9. Okay, in terms of...
Was there one? I don't remember. I had an S9. Why don't I remember one? I had the black one. Oh yeah, really? Was it the S9? I thought the S10 had like a gray version. Maybe I'm misremembering.
Wait, so this...
I'll trust Dave on this one.
With its titanium rail, is a lighter phone than the previous generation, like the iPhone 14 Pro. Now, one thing to keep in mind is that even though the weight difference isn't substantial, like numerically,
it is actually substantial. It's almost 10%. 10% is usually when human sensors start to notice a real difference, right? Even if like a ton could fall on you, right? For one, you probably wouldn't be able to hold it, but somebody could add like 50 kilograms on top of that, which would be 5%, and you probably wouldn't notice. Now, you probably wouldn't be able to hold either, but it's meaningless to you. But if it's 100 kilos more, then it's a different discussion. Both would kill you, but maybe it would feel more painful to hold 1.1 tons instead of 1 ton. And it goes down to a very small degree. This is medical truth, which is when you go to around 10%, this is when you start noticing meaningful differences in pressure. Temperature is calculated weirdly when it comes to 10%, so it does not fully apply here. But because obviously there's a difference between Kelvin and Celsius, you cannot really do also like real percentage difference in temperatures that way. But like pressure especially is where you feel it, and weight. And weight and pressure are somewhat synonymous. Usually pressure has more force just than the gravitational force, or unless we are considering something that's falling from really high, then it obviously exerts a lot more pressure. But if you're holding something statically in your hand, then a 10% difference is where you start to notice it. But also we've had like a physics guy calculate it, and he said because the weight difference is primarily coming from the outer edges of the device, this is why you feel it more, because the way your phone like would technically accelerate, you would say, in your hand as you move it, is like less pronounced, because now more of the weight is in the center proportionally. Thincha, you can hold 1.1 tons, but only once, and I would argue for only a short period of time. But hey, on the moon you could probably, right? I don't remember quite the difference between the gravitational force of the moon. You could probably hold it long enough on the moon to get away from it, right? Like do the Elden Ring like dodge roll underneath. But yeah, it's definitely not something I encourage on planet Earth.
Of weight. It's just a different feeling kind of phone. So this is, like, if you think about the weight distribution on this thing, this now has an aluminum plate, and because it's got that aluminum plate with the titanium frame, I think the weight is distributed more evenly across the whole deviase. On the iPhone 14 Pro, this didn't have an aluminum plate, and there was also a
I don't think that's correct. I think all iPhones have an internal metallic structure. It just so happens that what Apple was showing during the presentation, like look back at like the iPhone 5C days, right? Which Apple called unapologetically plastic, but it still had an aluminum like internal basically housing. It is needed for like structural rigidity. It's needed for cooling and stuff like that. And the difference here is not that the aluminum is present. The difference is now that the aluminum is like integrated with the titanium on this molecular level, which helps, as I said in previous videos, with heat dissipation, with radio frequency transparency, and stuff like that.
That wrapped around the perimeter of this device. But when you compare it to the 15 Pro Max, this device is just, the weight distribution makes this device feel a lot lighter than the, you know, the 8 or 9% weight reduction that it has. It's only single digit in terms of like the absolute number, but it definitely feels more.
Okay, I'll not be anal about math. It's a single digit percentage, but in actual numbers it's a double digit percentage. It's a double digit change, not a percentage change.
Like agile phones. Point I'm trying to make is...
Yeah, he's absolutely right. He actually has apparently a very good intuitive understanding of how physics work in that regard.
This device it feels a lot lighter than just that what the numbers would seem to indicate, right? 8 or 9% doesn't seem that much, but it feels a lot lighter and it feels good. Okay, I want to move over to the cases. So Apple's iPhone cases, the ones that are available in the store, there's like your classic silicone, which I'm going to put onto this one, to demonstrate real quick, but they also have, in their kind of environmental efforts, gotten rid of the leather cases. So this is the fine woven material, and it's sitting on top of a Pro Max here, so the 15 Pro Max. But I have concerns about this material. Actually,
as do
let's talk
I.
about the silicone. This feels awesome, right? I feel
no, it does not feel awesome. I completely disagree with that. It feels like trash.
Huge fan of silicone, and I don't think that the shape of this case has changed much despite the new rounded edges.
Yeah,
but
it doesn't need to.
Fine woven material. This stuff, for one, it scuffs very easily. So I'm just going to demonstrate real quick. I'm just take my fingernail. Don't have super long fingernails, right? I mark it, and it's there, and it doesn't go away. Like this is there pretty much permanently. And if I did it a bunch of times, it would just scuff. And unlike leather, like leather scratches quite easily as well.
Yeah, I was going to say.
Patina's nicely. It's got this kind of worn leather look to it. It's a look. Worn like cloth? I don't know. It's not a look to me. Also, this doesn't feel particularly premium. I understand it's a recycled material, but this feels like...
I don't think it's 100% recycled, is it?
Kind of like bed sheeting. It's strange, and it's got that like...
Oh, but everything sounds bad when you do it. Oh my god, he's so triggering me.
It's not my favorite material, and the fabric is quite thin.
I've been critical about it. I've said before that I've actually liked the touch feel of the of fine woven. I don't think I'm quite as big of a fan as actually holding it, you know what I mean? But I did have similar like long-term durability thoughts. I actually didn't think of scratching it as like a real world test, which I'm kind of now thinking I'm kind of stupid not to, but yeah, it's interesting, and it lines up with what I have basically found out.
Compare this case to like the Pixel 5 case. This is obviously a dated case, quite a few years back, but this looked and felt like a very substantial weave case, right? This is like...
those cases are also designed to like minimize material usage to a degree. Like they are pretty much leather, but not leather, right? They're not designed to be like more substantial.
Maybe they had to keep it thin for the magnets. Like I'm just thinking maybe
well
they need the
well no, they can put in extra magnets in between.
Magnets to be a particular strength. They got to keep this material really thin so the accessories stick to it. I don't know, but it just ain't my speed. There is a clear case, a new clear case from D-Brand. This is called their Ghost case. So you can
I don't
see
like
through
it.
And you can see the
I think it adds too many
language,
accents
design
to
language and the materials
Nope.
of the new phones. which is kind of
Just buy a
I
clear
wanna talk about
case
the
from
action
Apple.
button. So on the iPhone 15,
I know that Dbrand is like promising that this will never yellow, which I guess could be a long-term advantage. But like my 13 Pro Max hasn't yellowed in the slightest in 2 years.
and 15 Plus,
I think a lot of people are coming from like this understanding about clear cases that almost dates back to like silicon versions, like those like more hard plastic ones. If they are somewhat premium, they honestly don't yellow that poorly. And at that point, if they yellow after like 4 years, then my question is like, are you still using that phone? Are you using a phone with the exact same body dimensions so that you could be using it? Probably not.
it still has that standard mute switch. We've seen this for well over a decade on the iPhone, and it's just like your standard switch to turn notifications
I wish
on.
I could speed this up a little.
But the new
I'll
iPhone
have to
15
look into
Pros
how to do this in
have
OBS.
an action button. And this is a button that's like customizable input, and it's the first kind of customizable button we've ever had on an iPhone, which is kind of cool. But it does take some time to get used to because we're so used to just mute switches from literally over a decade of using stuff like that. The software control for muting the phone now is a little bit different. But in terms of what you can do with the action button, there's a whole bunch of things like you can put it to different focus modes. You have your camera launcher. You can launch a flashlight, voice memos, shortcuts. I've personally set it to the camera. And for me, it's just like anytime I've ever had any kind of like winter sports, you can't launch the camera without taking off your gloves and like launching the phone. Or you have to have like touch sensitive gloves that can like, you're like poking a screen. To be able to long press a button to launch a camera, so much easier. It's so Android, for lack of a better term, but I like it. And I think most people will as well. Just take some time.
I would almost say it's so camera this way, right? Because obviously like having like a shutter button and something that also like turns on the camera in a way is very like regular camera stuff.
Get used to it. Now, I do wish there was some kind of tactile marking on it so you could feel for it in your pocket to know that this was the thing that you were long pressing to do your action. All right, let's talk about the displays. So the iPhone 15 and 15 Plus have significantly improved displays compared to the previous generation. I think they changed them in ways that just I wouldn't have expected. So these
Same.
now both have bigger screens than the iPhone 14 and 14 Plus from last year. These have the same screen size and resolution as the Pro models. These have the same brightness, the same peak brightness, the same dynamic island up top. It's got the same HDR capabilities. It's really weird how close they are in terms of the overall screen.
Except for
I'm most surprised by the 2000 nits in peak brightness. It's just for legibility when you're outdoors, but that's something that companies usually reserve for like their flagship stuff. But the non-Pro models are still missing two features. First, it doesn't have an always-on display, if that matters to you. But the second thing is that this is still running a 60 hertz display on the non-Pro amateur model. And I really think they use it to distinguish the difference between like the pros and the amateurs because
But it's also a different technology at its core. LTPS versus LTPO, one that really well natively supports adaptive refresh rate, LTPO versus one that doesn't, and LTPO also in general is more efficient.
I don't think that the cost of production is that far apart at this point.
It's also meaningfully different, not in just in production cost, but the difference is in availability. Samsung themselves is not using LTPO on their high-end non-ultra S series. They don't use it on the S23. They don't use it on the S23 Plus. They use it on their high-end foldables and their ultra devices. Next year will likely be the first year where Samsung will use LTPO on all S models, right? The S24, 24 Plus, and of course the Ultra. And then in 2025 is where Apple will likely use LTPO across all their iPhones.
At least not for Apple because the volumes are so high. But when I review these phones and you see them side by side, the 60 hertz it's got this stutter, right? But I really think if I remove myself from the situation, I try to like not be a sweaty tech nerd about it, I really think like 99% of the world doesn't care about it.
They don't.
Many of my friends.
They don't, and sales are already showing that the 15 and 15 Plus are selling 10% better than the 14 and 14 Plus. And yes, it does have like technically some better features, but like I think most people are buying it for like the 48 megapixel main sensor, not even considering stuff that I would consider, like the ultra wide not being enhanced in any meaningful way, still not offering macro mode or something like that. I think it's just an opportunity for people in like maybe a slightly lower income class to get an iPhone now that it finally has USB-C, which might have prevented some people from buying it. And then across the board, the 15 Pros are selling really well, especially the Pro Max.
Family members are like, yeah, that's cool. That promotion is neat and all, but like, who cares? And in that line, it's like very little media takes advantage of that stuff. Very few games take advantage of 120 hertz, but it's mostly just the UI.
Videos don't take advantage of it. It's
UI
UI and reading, yeah.
Having promotion,
like scrolling through the browser,
is just so much nicer to look at if your eyes are used to it. And the fact that they don't have it is just ridiculous, because there are phones out there that are like $300 that have 120 hertz displays. For it to be missing on a $700 phone, it hurts. And in terms of the bezels,
I thought it's $800.
Regular iPhone 15, the bezels are a little bit thinner compared to last year. These are more aligned with like the 14 Pro models from last year, but the 15 Pro models, they're very thin, the bezels. I will say, this is just anecdotal story here. When I'm playing games, sometimes the meat of my hand would be touching the screen, and because the bezels are so thin, it would interfere with the button.
Okay, that's a funny way to put it. The meat of.
But it did happen a few times on the 15 Pro. Also,
this is why I've said repeatedly that I don't think that ever so always thinner bezels are always a good thing. I do think they look cool, and I obviously won't mind some accidental inputs for getting a phone with bezels as thin as this, but getting some like bezels even thinner, I don't think is even necessary in any way. I don't think going even lower than the 14 Pro was really necessary. Quite honestly, I could have dealt in perpetuity, as I've said, with bezels the size on like the 13 Pro on my phone. It just so happens that yes, it is cool, but it's not really meaningful.
I think the front glass on all the new devices is actually slightly curved at the edges. If you run your finger against it, you can feel it. So screen protectors
it looks
might not
that way
easily
with the
cover
light.
that full front screen.
I don't care.
And in terms
it looks
of the
good.
ports, so thanks to the EU, we have USB-C ports, baby. We've always wanted this. I'm still in disbelief that this is like something I'm staring at. USB-C ports on an iPhone.
And
so
standard ones as well.
Regular iPhone has USB 2 speeds. Pro model has USB 3 speeds. There's no like malicious intent here. I see a lot of the comments are like, oh my gosh, why does the regular iPhone 15 still have USB 2? I think it was just the chip. This chip that's in here.
That's not 100% true. You can pair something with basically an extra chip, let's say, to allow it to have more bandwidth. It's similar to how a CPU can use its own PCIe lanes to connect to storage or something like that, or sometimes you will have an extra chip inside the motherboard that will add some extra lanes. That is obviously like important in like the server space, where you might be already bottlenecked even with like a super large server CPU and stuff like that, because you want to connect so much storage. But the A16 can support USB 3, just not by default. You would need to put something basically in between. And so again, it's not a slam dunk or pro Apple argument here. This is where I will actually say that I am more anti-Apple than Dave is. But I don't consider it meaningful either for 99% of people. Like, I think USB 3 is very similar in that way to ProMotion, in which that it doesn't really change a lot for most people. So Apple forced to change to USB-C due to its USB 2 speeds. It's USB 2 on the regular models. It's USB 3 10 gigabits on the Pros.
A16 Bionic. It was never meant to have USB 3 speeds. It was just not a thing when that chip was developed, and that's the chip that's in here. So no USB 3. Now, if you do frequently dump massive files from your phone onto your laptop and you do need that speed, you gotta go for that.
I would also say anybody who's doing it would consider the pros anyway. Like, yes, I know some people will say, well, but what if I only have $800 to spend? Well, might I interest you then at that point in the Galaxy S23 Ultra, which has seen massive discounts since launch? Like, there is still a value difference. You are not entitled to any individual technological thing at any price point. That's why we like, as much as I am for some big reforms to the overall economy, I will never believe that companies are mandated to deliver you like certain spec points for a certain price. This is why I've been against a law-based mandate for USB-C, even though I want USB-C, even though I will be benefiting from it being USB-C. But I do have principles in that regard.
iPhone 15 Pro. We would also need a new cable because the one that comes in the box is this thing here. So this is a very nice looking braided cable, double-ended USB-C. However, this is USB 2.0. I see my Twitter light up with people who are very angry about this. It's very normal. Like, I can't think of any phone company or laptop company even that does include a USB 3 cable for charging. It's invariably like USB 2.0. That's the industry standard when it comes to...
Exactly, because people just put in like copper or whatever other metal to charge, and it's really easy to do. Like, there are literal like physical limitations to sometimes pushing through more data. Now, once you go with like optic fiber or something like that, then a lot of it will more depend on like how it's actually managed, I would say, like how the signal integrity is maintained, what quality you just made it of and stuff like that. But when you're using something, when you're making something as basic as a charging cable, it's pretty easy to add a little bit of like data transfer stuff to it, but a lot more. Sure, we are talking about profit margins, right? And there's definitely room in the profit margins to make this a USB 3 cable. But is it a meaningful difference for most consumers? And is it worth to also change the logistics chain behind it, right? Because Apple themselves did not create a USB 3 cable that they're trying to sell you. What instead they're doing, they're using a USB 2 for everything. They only like change between like 60 watts and 240 watts charging, which obviously one requires far more metal. At this point, I think the 240 watts cable should support USB 3, but it doesn't, unfortunately. But then once you go to Thunderbolt, you have to, well, Apple supports 240 watts. Not all older Thunderbolt cables support 240 watts. Some of them will be 100 watts. That's just updated with like the power delivery standard that is included in the cable. And so what happens is that Apple did not meaningfully change their own logistics lineup. They did not create a USB 3 cable whatsoever. And in fact, if you look online, you will actually struggle to find like one of the big companies, like your Anker, your Aukis, your Ugreens, delivering you a comprehensive USB 3 speed C2C accessories. Like, they will have them sometimes, but most of their like charge accessories are all USB 2 speeds universally, and then they will have like Thunderbolt and stuff on the upper end. Some companies would rather sell you a somewhat cheaper Thunderbolt cable than they would sell you a USB 3 cable, because with Thunderbolt they can advertise even higher speeds. They know there are a lot of Mac users that want that as well, so there is a market for it, while there's not a big market for just USB 3 speeds. Like if someone wants to have like really good Samsung DeX functionality or something like that, though for that you would have that puck with all the adapters going out of it anyway.
Charging cables for charging. Okay, the other things you can plug up to that hole, basically anything with a USB connection. You can plug up keyboards and monitors. You can get like 4K 60 DisplayPort out, and you
This is also interesting because both phones apparently support 4K 60 out, so it's not actually limited by the throughput speed of for raw data. It apparently has its own, as I said before, the same thing that Apple could have done for data throughput speed. They've apparently put something in that manages video output, and that supports 4K at 60, which requires what, like 8 gigabits per second with like a lower bitrate or something. Obviously you need more, like standard HDMI 2.0 is like 20 something gigabits, but yeah, and then 4K 120 is like 32 or even like 48 depending on the specific HDMI 2.1 standard that you are using. So yeah, it's actually kind of interesting what Apple has focused on and what they haven't focused on.
You can charge your iPods, you can charge the old ones with lightning cable, and the new ones with the USB-C cable, because the new one has a USB-C port. Now in terms of performance, the A17 chip is
okay,
faster.
let's see. Snapdragon 8 Gen 2 is the green one here. So it's meaningfully slower. It was still slower, by the way, than the A16. But obviously A17 is way faster. I've seen, like, wait, is that Geekbench 5? Those are not Geekbench 6 results, are they? And then Wildlife Extreme Unlimited, that's a graphics benchmark showing that the A17 catches up to the Snapdragon 8 Gen 2. That is probably correct. There's actually a lot of graphics oomph in the Snapdragon 8 Gen 2. It just consumes quite a lot of power to do that. I think it runs like 3 watts higher at maximum power usage than the A16 did, doesn't it?
And
like Golden Reviewer has made like videos on it.
It can sustain a full workload a little bit longer than the previous generations of the iPhone Pros.
Oh, that's
nothing crazy. Like I don't.
Well, but that's really positive to me. I did not expect that. Well, I guess the efficiency focus on the A17 is real.
I think at this point, people are using their phone and being like, man, if only this phone was faster, right? That's just really not a thing. I will say that the GPU has seen like the biggest jump this year. They did showcase some games. I was able to test out an early build of Resident Evil Village. This looks very good for a phone. It's a really demanding game. I remember benchmarking this thing on like RTX 3080 laptops, even last year, and to see it running on a phone with all of the original assets at a consistent 30 frames per second is very cool. It feels like the GPU capabilities on this phone is similar to like a PS4 or like an Xbox One. It's very impressive considering the size of it, but it's like, in case people are wondering, like, is it like a PlayStation 5? It's not, but considering the size of the device, very impressive.
It will use 40 times less power than the PS5. So yeah, we are looking at something that will consume 220 watts to something that will use a little over 5 watts to sometimes it could be like 10 watts.
Now, in terms of battery life, so I ran the same battery testing that I did 3 years in a row now, and I didn't see
15 Pro Max, 14 Pro Max, 15 Pro, 14 Pro. Well, to me, those are all very positive results.
much of a change in terms of like the...
It doesn't need to. Those are fantastic results. Like next year is the year we're getting the battery life upgrades.
Overall battery life of the phone, but what I did notice was a big spike up in the gaming battery life. So
really?
Fortnite isn't a very demanding game.
I'll
but
just
it does
move my
suck up juice.
head.
And I ran this test a couple times. It's a lot better this year. I think it's just the GPU on the A17 Pro, a lot more efficient. Okay, I'm gonna wrap up with a conversation about the camera, but I'm gonna steer this conversation to just how I use the camera, like the stuff that I find interesting or important.
Like kid stuff, maybe,
so,
mostly.
all 4 of the new iPhone 15.
Obviously, I don't mean that like in a negative way. He has kids and he takes photos of them. Didn't want to imply anything malicious here.
This year have a 48 megapixel main sensors, both the regular devices and the Pro devices. The sensor on the...
I actually would say, given that he is reviewing both phones, like both Pros and both non-Pros, it's actually a really well-paced video. Well done, Dave.
Pro device.
Man, I ended up like shitting mostly on the women and praising the men. It's really not what I want. Like, at least I should maybe like review Marquez more often, because then at least I don't look like a racist because I like Marquez. but yeah, like I don't know. This was the wrong choice of like pro video, like good videos versus mediocre videos. But again, I did not dislike iJustine's video. I just didn't like it as much as I could have. And the Verge video had some cringe stuff. It wasn't technically bad.
This is going to be bigger and better, but still 48 megapixels. And they also shoot with 24 megapixel files. So
also, the sensors in the 15 Pros will be bigger, but not better by default. Like they will be better in some ways because they are bigger, but this is technically a newer generation of sensor that is currently in like the latest Sony phones. It's not technically worse. Also, now I actually see the blue. Now that it's really put against the white background, I actually see the very coolest blue, because I was looking at them like, wait, is this a different phone? No, now I actually just see the blue.
you took like the original 12 megapixel file from yesteryear, and you added 50% more pixels going up, and then 50% more pixels going wide. That would be the new shot. So it's about 50% bigger in terms of file size. I would say on the regular iPhone 15s, the shots in 24 megapixels are more detailed, slightly, but I just don't think worth that extra size.
I think, given that we're talking about 3 megabytes on phones that start with 128 or 256 gigabytes, is actually absolutely worth it. Going from 2 megabytes to 3 megabytes, or in some scenarios even going up from just 1.3 to 2 megabytes, I really don't see that as a problem. Plus, you also get like the extra depth data in general, which I assume could be a little improved with 24 megapixels, right? You could do a little bit more pixel precise portrait mode. Obviously it would still be extremely precise regardless, but there are some other advantages to just using a higher resolution.
Extra 50% size is like, it fills up your phone faster, it's harder to work with, you're sending out more data if you're sharing photos. It's a lot, and I don't feel like the sensor on the regular.
Let me tell you, as somebody who takes a lot of pictures and takes them in Pro RAW on a 256 gigabyte iPhone 13 Pro Max, where resulting files are like what? Like, I'll just briefly go into like my Photos app. Where's the last picture I've taken that is actually like meaningful in its resolution, right? It's Pro RAW, good. And how big is it? It is it's a telephoto image, but it's 41 megabytes. It's 41 megabytes. Man, it looks also so good. Let me look at something that is coming from the main sensor. Yeah, here, my cat. I think I've captured that, and like no, that's also the telephoto camera. Why am I only taking telephoto pictures for some reason recently? Yeah, I guess this has to be, right? This doesn't, like, info. And yes, it's f1.5, 26 millimeters. It's 33 megabytes for an indoor photo that I take, and I still have only filled up half of my storage after 2 years. And I believe I do not have optimized cloud storage on. Here's another picture that is 28 megabytes, also beautiful HDR. So yeah, it's definitely interesting in that regard. Like like a darker picture is 22 megabytes. It's where I took a picture of my iPhone playing like the Nintendo Switch emulator, and then here's like a beautiful portrait shot of my cat. It's 2 megabytes. Oh, it's a Hive image, right? It's an HEIF image. And this, I believe, is a normal picture. It's 32 megabytes, so it's between 28 and 35 megabytes somewhere on my phone. I believe it goes up to like 50 megapixels or something like that when you have like the 48 megapixel on the 14 Pro. So yeah, anybody who's like saying that sub 5 megabyte images are in any way a problem, and here we are talking about like a difference of literally like less than 1 megabyte between those images, to me I just don't take that serious.
iPhone 15s really.
Where is the detail better? Well, it's also problematic, right? Because I'm watching this through, I believe, a 1080p video, and I'm watching it on like a non-pixel native like panel, because I do watch it in like a portion of OBS. But like spontaneously, I wouldn't. Well, I do think that when it comes to the leaves, there's no difference. Well, no, the 24 does look a little better. But I would say like part of the tree, I guess. I don't know what it's directly connected to, or part of the stick here is like definitely like not equally sharp on both. It's not equally in focus, and there's some like I would almost say there's some like color science differences because of the level of detail. It's very minute, but. Like, let me just move my face away here. Here, right? Well, okay, yeah, the upper leaf is like way more detailed in 24 megapixels, but I think that's a focus thing, not an actual like quality thing. Yeah, so I cannot really make like a great conclusion here.
Really makes good use of that extra resolution, but on the Pro, I would say it is worth it. The detail is there. I think it's absolutely worth that larger file size.
Okay, dude, that's an interesting distinction. Well, that actually might be very interesting, because obviously, like by the logic of that, you have a 48 megapixel sensor, even though it's a different one, and you have an A16 chip with 6 gigabytes of memory. There's a good argument to be made that the 14 Pro could give you 24 megapixels, but there's also probably the point that the way the A16 is built, there's really no meaningful difference, because it still has obviously the older image signal processor. It might just be that Apple enabled it to say that both phones use like the same generation of tech, right? Because that's what Apple usually does. So to me, it's actually seems more like this is an A17 feature that was then backported to the A16, but it just does not fully live up to expectations there.
Decision, if I had either one of the regular phones, I would just set it to the 12 megapixel shot, just save that file space. And then if I had it on the Pro, I mean, the 12 megapixel shots still look better anyways, but if you want that extra resolution and you don't mind.
Tincha, you said you stopped watching The Verge after the catastrophic PC build guide. I never hold like somebody accountable for like one like mistake on the entire outlet. I mean, like I stopped reading The Verge for the most part when it comes to like a lot of like just lazy reporting in general. I will see some of their articles on like Twitter and stuff, and this is when I will usually comment on it, but I don't go out of my way to like open up The Verge and stuff like that. You can see that in like my last well, I didn't even open it up on the screen, but I got like something from The Verge for my Xbox video, and that for me is absolutely fine because I got some like ground truth PDFs from there. And I usually do that because I know that The Verge is pretty reactionary in that regard. It usually has those articles up pretty fast. Yeah, for all my Apple stuff, I just read 95Mac, Mac Rumors, Apple Insider, stuff like that.
Larger files, it can take advantage.
Thinja, and you stopped watching LTT after the latest drama. Well, this is how we also met. So, yeah, I did not stop watching LTT because I do, I do not really watch them. I just check out what they're making to inform myself whether or not there's something worth covering for me. The only difference is though they've actually done a little bit of Apple stuff, and I've integrated that in one of my reaction videos recently. It just so happens that I just don't think there's anything worthwhile about their content. Whenever it's not as bad as what's covered in the Gamers Nexus video, it just borders on the boring. It's just not that well informed to be like interesting for nerds. I don't don't think it's that like well written to be interesting to an like a funny haha looking audience. So I think it's just this middle ground that attracts a lot of people, because LTT is such an old institution at this point on YouTube. But you can see it being with how Marquez has overtaken it. Like LTT is growing based on a lot of momentum that was established 5 or 10 years ago. LTT is not growing based on momentum from how good the channels actually are these days. They're just like riding still, like we know who Linus is, we know like what Tech Wiki is and stuff like that, and they're trying to do spin-offs based on that, and subscribers on YouTube will keep growing almost regardless, as long as you keep putting out decently popular content. Like I added like 60 to 70 subscribers in 3 days, which sure is not a lot by any means. It's just that the percentage to my channel is huge, and I think that kind of happened because I have created an almost critical mass of content where YouTube can now recommend so many of my videos, and there's always new viewers every day because of that. Which makes it really interesting. Now maybe I should put out some like non-live stream videos, but I do enjoy my live streams most. This is why I'm making this.
Of it. Now in terms of low light photography, it's still not great. I mean, Apple talked a little bit about how they improved it, but the Pixel 7 devices and Samsung's S23 devices look better to me.
Nope, I completely disagree. I have not seen Samsung beat even the 14 Pro in low light photography. I know this is like a little bit of like it's like a preference thing. I think you could make the point that the Pixel is like a choice between the iPhone and the Pixel. I don't see that with the Samsung, not whatsoever. It's artificially brightened. There's not a lot of detailed in their night and I do criticize that, by the way, in a very high level. This is me literally comparing the S23 Ultra versus the 14 Pro Max versus the 15 Pro Max, right? But to me, also people do this testing really wrong. They usually test automatic like image aggregation versus manual one, and the problem is that what the Samsungs will usually do, they will make you like take 3 seconds for the picture, right? And obviously that will make it ever so slightly brighter, but then the iPhone will trying to prioritize time will give you 1 second, but then obviously it has like less light that aggregates in that image. So what you need to do as a good tester is just manually move that iPhone up to the same 3 seconds, or the Galaxy down to 1 second, and then you can actually do those testings. Like I have seen a ton of tests that fail to do that.
Apple also talks about how they addressed some of the lens flare that has been in some of their photography. So sometimes you'll see some reflective orbs floating around in some of your shots. They're definitely less pronounced on the iPhone 15 cameras, but they're still visible here and there, and it's particularly noticeable still in night shots with bright lights.
Yeah,
in terms of the multiple focal lengths that they have for the main sensor, I can shoot like 24, 28, and 35 millimeter. When I first saw the presentation, I was like, that's kind of neat, but isn't it just like crops? Like
it's not.
It seems like it was just cropping in on that main sensor. It turns out there's a lot more to it. So there is a very interesting...
I think Apple probably put that in the review guidelines. This is actually why review guidelines exist. It's always good for people to give their opinion on what a technology results in. But the problem is that sometimes people will review results without understanding the base technology whatsoever. And like the detail difference between the main 48 megapixel 24 millimeter mode versus 28 versus 35, yes, those are pretty minimal, but the detail will still be a little higher once you like zoom in a little. Like if you like take the picture at 24 millimeter, it will be a little sharper than capturing at 24 millimeter and then doing a 1.2x crop afterwards, right? However, that might not be always visible. Sometimes the light will be so good that it basically is meaningless difference, and sometimes the difference will be so meaningless because the base quality is already so bad because it's such a low light scenario. that some people will not internalize that. So what some people could come out and say is, oh, Apple is advertising 2 new lenses, those bastards, they're just doing digital zoom, and they are not. They're doing what Google is also doing with like their some of their modes. So this to me is like, it seems like to reviewers, Apple has really told them that this is not just digital zoom, and please don't cover it this way. And I assume if somebody got like early iPhone access and is still saying that, then I'm pretty sure that they will not be getting early iPhone access next year. Not because they've given Apple a bad review even, but because they've covered their technology in an objectively wrong way. Even though I'm an Android team, I agree that iPhone camera is top tier. Yeah, I just think that some of the tests are not done the right way. Like, I've used the latest Galaxies versus the latest iPhones. I know how much better night mode there is on the iPhone. It just so happens that Pixel can be sometimes better because of specific algorithms, right? I would say in general, I would still prefer the iPhone, but maybe this year's Pixel will actually pull ahead. I have no problem with that. I for years said that the Pixel has better stills photography than the iPhone in so many ways. It's just that when people try to conflate it with like just for neutrality's sake, they will make up stuff where the Samsung is superior. It's like, dude, there's a ton of color science difference there. Like it probably used a different exposure method, like timing even. Like don't make shit up just to like just compare to the Pixel at that point, or say it's a wash against the Samsung. Don't say it looks better. It didn't at all.
Technical method as to how they do it. Like, so they're capturing light data from multiple lenses and then fusing it together to create the image. It's very cool in terms of how it's done, but in terms of how I use my camera, like, I don't feel like I've ever taken a shot and switched, wanted to even, you know, the difference between a 24 and a 28 millimeter is very small, at least for the stuff that I shoot. And then even at 35, not that useful for my personal photography. Okay, but the thing that I thought was the coolest thing by far
Portrait.
is the automatic portrait mode. And I actually think that this is going to be...
People with kids will love this.
...copied by other phone companies. It's the ability to just basically take a shot, not think about it, and the phone will capture the depth data so you can adjust the focus later. And to not think about it, like to just not have to press portrait mode and just does it automatically is super cool. So if it detects a face, or like a human face or a pet's face, it can supposedly do it. I did notice that it only works for like large pets. Like my kid has a goldfish, it didn't work for that. But if you have just regular large face,
could you do that with like with like manual focus? As we've seen in the Mrwhosetheboss video, but that was also a larger object, so I assume that LiDAR wouldn't help here.
It works, and it works really well.
But man, that's a really good image, by the way. That goldfish looked sharp as hell.
And just the ability to adjust this stuff in post, but not think about it when you take the shot, is so useful. Like, it's just a nice looking shot, but you do need to keep in mind that that original shot that you take has to be in focus. Like, if it wasn't in focus, it won't be able to
There's no
it,
real depth data. Yes, sure.
Okay, last thing, the zoom. So
well, there's also the counterpoint that not the real, like, there's always something in focus on an image, right? Unless it focuses on like a dirt piece that is on the lens directly, which is not how lenses usually work. Yeah, like this actually could work in that regard, where you take something unfocused, but if it focused on that wrong thing well and it created that depth data, then you could actually, like, you know, change that DF rating, right? And then it would probably work. I'm not sure if there's like a meaningful difference if something is in the foreground or something is in the background. It worked in pretty much all the images that I've seen yet in tests.
I'm sure you're aware by now, the iPhone Pro Max, iPhone 15 Pro Max, has a zoom lens, and this thing is a 5x optical zoom. Actually, you can see the difference between. So this device here is the regular 15 Pro. and you can see the lens right there. And the 15 Pro Max has a much larger aperture for that zoom lens. A couple thoughts. I don't think that the 5x telephoto is particularly powerful. Samsung has 10x opticals that are twice as powerful. I think that
that's not what powerful means. Okay, let me move my face again. I'll put it on the pixel image. Okay, so tell me who's more detailed here. Yes, Samsung is more detailed on a 10x because it's a well-lit studio. The iPhone looks to be way more detailed than the Pixel, which seems to have abstracted a lot of detail away from the wall behind it. But obviously I cannot zoom in into the image as well.
It's good that they're back. They're more competitive in terms of the zoom game. They've been comically behind for years.
They're not. 10x, like look at this image. Tell me what the usefulness of that extreme zoom is. Like if Samsung had a really high quality 3x zoom, I would understand it, right? Because then I would say, okay, you zoom in from 1x to like 3x, or you zoom in from 0.5 to 1, then between 1 and 3, and then between 3 and whatever, and then the next range, right? But to zoom between 3x and 10x, you would need to have a decent telephoto 3x camera. And as I've said before, somewhere around 3.5, somewhere between 4x is where I take most of my images. So to me, 5x is actually a little bad, but what I can do is I can still move a little behind and still utilize a relatively wide aperture, a larger sensor than what is on the Samsung 10x zoom, right? So sure, while I might not get the same detail at 10x, but like I can get my 5x really good, and I can then get my 6 or 7x, which is pretty much the farthest I would ever zoom in, still to look decent, while it's on Samsung with the way it's currently is. And I've said before, if Samsung introduces wearable zoom technology to the S24 Ultra, I will be the first to praise them. But with the way it's currently set up, Samsung's 3x is more worthless than Apple's 3x was, and their 10x does not cover a lot of meaningful ground for people like me. And I think I'm pretty much in the majority here. I don't know who's capturing a ton of 10x photos. Also, 10x photos in general are hard to capture because obviously like shaking is a bigger issue the farther you zoom in. Samsung has improved it. It was garbage on the first gen where they introduced it, but yeah, I really don't get it. People will sometimes be like, oh, they're woefully behind on this specific thing, but then you think of something like MagSafe, right, which was an iPhone 12 innovation, right, which came out at a similar time as Samsung's 10x periscope zoom started to come out, and nobody's like explaining it this way, even though MagSafe has had a far bigger impact on how I use accessories, charging, stuff like that. I have hated wireless charging till MagSafe. I've had an iPhone XS. I never charged it wirelessly. I'm not a hypocrite here. But people will just focus on like 5 versus 10x without any regard for like, this is a larger sensor, this has a wider aperture. Like come on, Dave. You can do that.
The Pixel's 7 Pro, their 5x zoom is arguably better in terms of like sharpness and detail that's able to capture at that 5x. But the fact that the iPhone has a
it's interesting because I wouldn't even necessarily try to disagree with that, because I don't have much experience with the Pixel 7 Pro. I wonder if I can find like those images like natively. It doesn't really matter to me, but yeah, like look at that Galaxy image. Like what am I getting out of this image? Like there is also no meaningful way where you could move out far enough to also look at how the water looks like super processed here. It's like, and the grass is not even meaningfully sharper, I bet you. like also, by the way, like I will not shit on the color reproduction in either image because obviously the sun could have shifted a little bit, but the iPhone and the S Ultra actually look more similar to each other than the Pixel 7 Pro, which is interesting. I hope he does some HDR comparison, because that was the one thing where I have been always open that Apple is a little behind, sometimes more than a little. So let's see.
Zoom is great. Now, I think the one conversation that might come up is like, should you get the Pro or the Pro Max or the Pro? Because when you go with the Pro Max, your zoom range is like, you start at 5x, and anything underneath 5x is not an optical zoom. It's like cropped sensors. And on this device, because it has the 3x zoom, like the original older style 3x zoom, you do have that kind of mid-range telephoto covered a little bit better. My take on it is that it doesn't matter. It really doesn't matter. If you're getting sweaty over this because you're like a professional photographer, that's a whole separate question. But if you're just someone who wants to buy a phone and you want to take photos like normal human beings of your family and friends and just things that you do in your life, don't buy the phone based on its zoom capabilities.
Yeah.
Buy it for everything else.
That's
just my take on it. Okay, pricing. The base model started at $800. The Pro model started at $1,000. But I found that chart again where someone on Reddit had graphed out or charted out the percentage of yearly income that it would take for someone to purchase one of these base model iPhone 15.
show me Brazil.
Show me Brazil. Countries, but at the
Costa Rica, Chile, okay.
top of the list was Myanmar. That's the country.
Okay. Armenia, Indonesia. I actually 20% of my viewers are Indonesian, so I'm sorry guys. 36% of your income. That's rough. Okay, Brazil is not apparently in the top 10 with their like import costs, but I guess these countries are still meaningfully lower in average income. It's actually an interesting list. It's also the iPhone 15, not even the 15 Pro. That's rough, baby. 90% for Myanmar. And look at the difference to Pakistan. This has nothing to do with just Apple's pricing. This is clearly an economic issue. I assume they might have some inflationary problems recently. Kenya, obviously low income. Nigeria, I actually expected to be maybe better than like something like Niger, or Niger, I should say. So that's curious. From what I understand, Nigeria has a higher like average income than many other African countries, but obviously I'm not an Africa economist.
And it's just crazy to see how expensive this phone can be for a lot of people.
Oh, and that's also to annual salary. That's such super rough. Yeah, then I assume nobody is buying one in Myanmar. Kind of makes me wonder what the smartphone penetration of, or at least of like decently modern smartphones is, right? Like anything above $300. I just wonder what that, like how that gets adopted in Myanmar. I kind of assume that all these like top 10 countries are like 90% plus, 95 to 99% like Android, and then there's like a wealthy elite that buys iPhones.
In this world, I think it's something we should keep in mind when we look at the prices of these iPhones. Okay, there you have it, the iPhone 15.
Okay. Good review. Some of the things not really questionable. It's just I would have done it differently. Now there is another video, but I will not be covering it anymore because this has now turned into what, like a 3.5 hour stream. Like, let me just briefly go through it. Yeah, this is now 3.5 hours. I do have to go to bed at some point. I've actually felt really sick. I don't know. This stream has kind of helped me become a little healthier. Thank you all so much who joined, who commented. Again, a big shout out to all the new subscribers. Please follow me on Twitter. Consider supporting me on Patreon. As always, do all that YouTube jazz that I encourage you to do. And I'll see you guys with this video and then other camera videos hopefully pretty soon. Maybe not tomorrow, maybe a little later than that, but yeah, pretty soon. Thank you guys so much. This is Mark Tech, tuning out.